That morning, Ethan Walker left his apartment with $23 in his wallet, an overdue rent notice stuffed under his door, and a little girl who still believed her daddy could fix anything. He was nobody, no title, no connections, no safety net. She was Isabella Sterling, worth $4 billion, feared in every boardroom on 3 continents, and utterly alone behind all of it. They had never met. They never should have. But fate doesn't ask permission. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, and let's begin. Like, stay until the yum. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Ethan Walker lay flat on his back staring at the water stain on the ceiling, the one shaped vaguely like a boot, the one he'd been meaning to report to the landlord for 4 months. And he did not move. Not because he was lazy, not because he didn't have 1,000 things waiting on him. He didn't move because for just a few seconds, before the day fully loaded itself onto his shoulders, he allowed himself the small luxury of stillness. Then he heard her. "Daddy." A pause. The shuffle of small feet on linoleum. "Daddy, I can't find my other sock." He was up before she finished the sentence. Sophie Walker was 8 years old, gap-toothed, and absolutely relentless. She stood in the doorway of his bedroom wearing one purple sock with a cartoon fox on it and holding the other in her fist like evidence at a crime scene. "I looked everywhere," she announced. "Everywhere?" "Everywhere, everywhere." Ethan ran a hand over his face, scratched the back of his neck, and crossed the room to kneel in front of her. He checked under the edge of her pajama leg. Nothing. He glanced back toward the hallway and spotted the second sock sitting exactly where she had dropped it the night before, halfway between the bathroom and her bedroom door. He picked it up and handed it to her without a word. Sophie looked at it. Looked at him. "Oh. Yeah. I swear I looked there." "I know you did, Bug." She sat down on the floor right there in the hallway and started putting her sock on with the focused concentration of a surgeon, tongue slightly out. Ethan watched her for a moment, this small, stubborn, ordinary miracle, and something moved through his chest that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness exactly. It wasn't happiness either. It was something that lived between the two, in the space that grief carves out when it finally stops being sharp and starts just being permanent. He went to make breakfast. The kitchen of their apartment on Caldwell Street was narrow enough that you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out, which Sophie had done approximately 800 times since they moved in. The refrigerator ran loud and always slightly warm on the left side, so Ethan kept the milk on the right. The burner on the front left clicked 3 times before it caught. These were the things you learned. These were the negotiations you made with a life that didn't have much margin for error. He cracked 2 eggs into the pan and listened to them sizzle. Outside, the city of Hartford was already moving. He could hear the 6 a.m. bus grinding up the hill, the distant bark of someone's dog, the mechanical clunk of a garbage truck making its rounds. These sounds had become the texture of his mornings, the audio backdrop against which he assembled whatever version of OK he could manage before sending Sophie off to school and himself off to whatever job site was waiting. He was a construction foreman, had been for 6 years. Before that, he'd been a general laborer for 4 years before that, working his way up through sheer stubbornness and the kind of attention to detail that made site managers trust him with things they wouldn't hand to men twice his age. He was good at the work, genuinely good. He understood load-bearing, drainage, foundation integrity, material tensile strength. He could read a blueprint the way other people read a newspaper, quickly, completely, with an immediate sense of what mattered and what didn't. None of that paid what it should have. He made $51,000 a year. Before taxes, after childcare, rent, Sophie's asthma medication, the minimum payment on a credit card he'd maxed out the winter his wife died, when the funeral costs hit, and the insurance company delayed and delayed and then delayed again. After all of it, there was never quite enough. Not dangerously not enough. But not enough in the way that meant he checked his bank balance before buying groceries. Not enough in the way that meant Sophie's birthday present this year had been a second-hand bike he'd spent 3 weekends fixing up in the parking garage downstairs. And he'd been more nervous presenting it than he'd been about anything in years, because if she was disappointed, he didn't have a backup plan. She hadn't been disappointed. She'd screamed and thrown her arms around his neck and asked if she could ride it inside, which, absolutely not. But still, he worried about the next birthday. He worried about a lot of things. Sophie came into the kitchen and climbed onto her chair with the systematic effort of someone scaling a small mountain. What's for breakfast? Eggs? Can I have cereal instead? We're out of the good cereal. What about the bad cereal? Ethan glanced at her. The bran flakes? She made a face that communicated everything she felt about bran flakes. Eggs it is, he said. She propped her chin on her hand and watched him plate the food. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of warm brown that caught light differently depending on the angle, sometimes almost amber, sometimes nearly black. It was the thing that undid him sometimes, when he wasn't prepared for it. He'd turn around and she'd be looking at him with that specific tilt of her head, and he'd have to busy himself with something, with anything, just to get a moment to breathe through it. Claire had been gone for 4 years. 4 years, 2 months, and he tried not to count the days anymore. He'd read somewhere that counting the days was a way of refusing to let the wound close, and he wasn't sure he agreed, but he'd made himself stop anyway, mostly because it frightened him how precise he could be about it. The accident had been stupid in the way most tragedies are stupid. A driver ran a red light. Claire had been on her way home from her night shift at the hospital. She was a pediatric nurse, had been since before Sophie was born, and she never made it. The police said she likely didn't feel anything. He appreciated the intention behind that. He didn't entirely believe it, but he appreciated it. What followed was the kind of year that rearranged a person at a structural level. Not just grief, though there was plenty of that, a whole geography of it, mountains and valleys and sudden drop-offs where the ground just disappeared, but also the logistics, the raw, grinding, relentless logistics of becoming a single parent overnight. Sophie had been 4. Old enough to know something had happened, not old enough to fully understand what, old enough to ask, at random moments, "When is Mommy coming back?" in a voice so completely innocent that Ethan sometimes had to step outside and stand in the cold air for a minute before he could answer. He had answered the same way every time, carefully, honestly, as gently as the truth would allow. Eventually, Sophie stopped asking. He wasn't sure if that was better or worse. He dropped her at school at 7:45, which was 8 minutes later than he intended because she had decided at the last possible moment that the fox socks were wrong and she needed the rainbow ones, and the rainbow ones were at the bottom of the laundry basket, which was at the bottom of a whole separate problem he'd been putting off. "You're going to be fine," he told her at the gate. "I know," she said, with the particular confidence of a child who had not yet absorbed the full weight of what that phrase was supposed to reassure. "Mrs. Patterson said you can stay in at recess to finish your art project if you want." "I know, Dad." "Don't forget your inhalers in the front pocket." "Dad?" I know." She grabbed the straps of her backpack and looked at him with an expression that was somehow both 8 years old and 40. "I've got it. Go to work." He laughed. He couldn't help it. "Okay. Bye." She turned and walked toward the entrance without looking back, which was new. She'd started doing that recently, the not looking back, and he was trying to decide whether it was independence or distance, and whether there was even a meaningful difference at this age. He stood at the gate for an extra moment, watching until she disappeared through the door. Then he turned and started the 12-block walk to the bus stop. Eneb. The job site that week was a mid-rise commercial renovation on Beacon Street, about 40 minutes across town. The developer was a company called Meridian Construction Group, mid-sized, regionally respected, occasionally infuriating to work for in the specific way that all construction companies are infuriating, which is to say, constantly changing timelines, inconsistently delivered materials, and a rotating cast of project managers who each had a different theory about what the building was supposed to become. Ethan had been freelancing for Meridian on and off for 2 years. He liked the crew. Didn't always love the management, but the pay was decent and they gave him enough advance notice on schedules that he could arrange Sophie's after-school care without constant scrambling, which was worth more than he could put a dollar figure on. His foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Ray Dominguez, who had been in construction for 22 years and had opinions about everything, was already on site when Ethan arrived. "You're 2 minutes late," Ray said, not looking up from the tablet he was holding. "Bus ran slow." "Buy a car." "Give me a raise." Ray looked up at that. He was somewhere in his late 40s with a gray-streaked beard and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades looking into sun and wind and fluorescent sight lighting. He had an expression that said many things simultaneously, most of them resigned. "Talk to somebody who controls the budget," he said. "You control the budget." "I control a portion of the budget, a small and humiliating portion." He handed Ethan the tablet. "Northeast section. Framing crew is arguing about the load distribution on the secondary beam. Go sort it out before somebody does something I have to write up." Ethan took the tablet and went to go sort it out. This was most of what being a foreman actually was. Not the physical work, though there was still plenty of that. Mostly it was reading a situation, understanding where the actual problem was versus where everyone thought the problem was, and finding the path through that caused the least damage to timeline, material, and crew morale. Ethan was good at this. Not in a flashy way. In a quiet, reliable, invisible way that tended to make people feel that problems solved themselves in his vicinity. He spent the morning on the northeast section. He mediated the beam dispute, which turned out to be less about the load distribution and more about two crew members who had a history going back to a different job site and hadn't resolved it, and then moved on to a drainage issue on the third floor that had appeared overnight and needed immediate attention before the concrete pour scheduled for Thursday. By noon, he'd eaten half a granola bar and drunk 2 cups of coffee from the site's ancient percolator, which produced a liquid technically classifiable as coffee, the way that technically certain flat surfaces are classifiable as beds. He called the school at 12:30 to check in, which he knew was excessive and did it anyway. "She's fine, Mr. Walker," said the woman at the front desk, whose name was Donna and who had learned his voice. "She's at lunch. She traded her apple for someone's fruit snacks again. She always does that." "I know. It's every Tuesday. Can you—" "I've already told her. She says the apple is better as a trade item than a food item." Ethan put his hand over his face. "That's honestly not wrong." "No," Donna agreed. "It's really not." He hung up and went back to the drainage problem. That evening he made pasta, the cheap kind in the blue box, which Sophie called real pasta, in contrast to the fancier kind he occasionally made from scratch, which she called weird pasta, a categorization that said everything about 8-year-olds and nothing about his cooking, which was actually quite good. They sat at the small table by the window that looked out over the parking lot, and Sophie told him about her day in the sprawling, non-linear way that children narrate events, jumping between lunch and art class, and a conflict at recess involving someone named Marcus, who had apparently committed some social infraction so severe it had reorganized the entire third-grade social landscape. "What did Marcus do?" Ethan asked. "He said that unicorns aren't real." "I mean, they're not." Sophie stared at him with genuine offense. "Dad?" "Sorry, what happened after that?" "Lily cried, and then everyone was mad at Marcus. But I think Marcus is just sad about something else." Ethan paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "Why do you think that?" Sophie shrugged, twirling her pasta with the focused attention of a philosopher. "Because when you say mean things for no reason, it's usually because you feel bad about something else. That's what you always say." He had said that. He couldn't remember when. "That's pretty smart, Bug." "I know. Not bragging, just factual." "Can I have more pasta?" He gave her more pasta. After dinner, he helped her with her math homework, which involved fractions, which Sophie found deeply offensive on a personal level. He tried 3 different ways of explaining the concept before she caught it. The third involved comparing fractions to how you split a pizza, which worked because everything Sophie cared about could eventually be mapped onto food. "So 1/3 is bigger than 1/4, she said slowly. "Right. Because 4 pieces means each piece is smaller." "Exactly." She stared at the worksheet. "That's backward from what it sounds like. Math does that sometimes. I don't like it." "I know. But I get it." "I know." She wrote down the answer, small and careful, pressing hard with her pencil the way she always did. Ethan watched her write and felt again that complicated thing in his chest. The grief and the pride tangled together so thoroughly that he'd stopped trying to separate them years ago. So, he put her to bed at 8:30, read to her for 20 minutes from a book about a girl who discovers she can talk to horses, which was the current obsession. Sophie fell asleep before the chapter ended, in the sudden, total way that children sleep, like a switch thrown. He sat in the doorway for a moment, listening to her breathe. Then he went to the kitchen table and opened his laptop and spent the next 45 minutes going through bills. The picture was not catastrophic. He was clear on that. He had friends who were in genuinely bad shape, people who'd lost jobs, lost health, lost housing. He wasn't there. But the margin was thin enough that any unexpected cost, a medical bill, a car repair, a shift in Sophie's medication coverage, could tilt things in a direction that would take months to recover from. He did what he always did. He organized the numbers into their columns. He moved things around. He identified the 2 bills he could defer without penalty and the 3 he couldn't. He noted that Sophie's next dental checkup was in 6 weeks and that his own had been overdue for almost a year and a half. He closed the laptop at 10:15. He brushed his teeth, changed out of his work clothes, and lay down on the bed that was still, after 4 years, slightly too big. He did not think about Claire. He had learned to do that, to move his thoughts to other places when they drifted toward her too late at night. Because grief at 10 p.m. was a different animal than grief at noon. It had more reach in the dark. Instead, he thought about the drainage problem on the 3rd floor. He thought about Sophie's fraction worksheet. He thought about the water stain on the ceiling, which he really did need to report. Sleep came, eventually. It always did. The next morning was a Thursday, and Thursdays meant the concrete pour on the Beacon Street site, and the concrete pour meant Ethan needed to leave 20 minutes earlier than usual, which meant the alarm went off at 5:24 a.m., which Sophie did not know about because she was a child, and that was not information she needed to have. He was quiet getting ready. Moved through the apartment in the dark, putting on his work clothes, filling a thermos, packing a lunch he'd prepped the night before. He checked Sophie's backpack. Inhaler in the front pocket, lunch in the main compartment, homework folder in the side. He kissed her on the forehead without waking her. She stirred slightly, made a small sound, settled. He walked out into a morning that was cold and gray and smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. The bus that ran to the downtown hub left at 6:05 from the stop on Mercer. He walked fast, collar up, hands in his jacket pockets. The streets were mostly empty. A few early joggers, a delivery driver stacking boxes outside a coffee shop, a man walking a very small, very determined dog. The bus came 2 minutes late. He got on, found a seat near the back, and stared out the window as the city rearranged itself from residential to commercial, from quiet to beginning to wake. He was thinking about load distribution, about whether the secondary beam solution the crew had landed on was correct, or whether he needed to revisit it before the pour, about whether he should call Ray when he got to the transfer point or wait until he was on site. He was not thinking about Isabella Sterling. He had never heard of Isabella Sterling. That was about to change. The downtown transfer hub at Civic Center Plaza was where he switched from the 14 to the 7, which would take him the rest of the way out to Beacon Street. He usually had about 8 minutes between buses, enough time to check his phone, drink from the thermos, watch the city. He was standing on the plaza at 6:52 when he noticed the crowd gathering across the street. Not a dangerous crowd, just people pausing on the sidewalk, looking upward, or toward the entrance of the steel and glass tower that anchored the corner of Sterling Avenue and 9th. The building had Sterling Group printed across its facade in letters large enough to read from a moving car. He didn't know what the Sterling Group was. He barely glanced at it. He checked his phone. The 7 was running 3 minutes late. He looked back up, and that was when he saw her. She came through the revolving doors of the Sterling Group building at precisely 6:54, and she walked the way certain people walk when they have spent their entire adult lives entering rooms and knowing, not hoping, that every person in that room would look up. Not arrogance exactly, something more structural than arrogance, something built into the bones. She was wearing a dark charcoal coat, fitted, over what appeared to be a gray suit. Her hair was dark, pulled back from her face. She was not particularly tall. She had the kind of face that made you want to look a second time, not because of any single feature, but because of the whole of it, the arrangement, the control in it. She had a phone to her ear and was speaking to someone, her expression composed, professional, revealing nothing. Two assistants trailed her at a respectful distance. A car was supposed to be there. It was not there yet. She stepped to the curb. Ethan watched this for approximately 3 seconds before looking back at his phone. He did not notice the black SUV idling half a block north. He did not notice the second man on the sidewalk, the one not moving with the morning foot traffic, the one standing very still against a building facade watching the woman at the curb with a fixed professional attention. He did not notice any of it. And then the SUV's engine gunned. And then time did the thing it does in moments like these, the thing no one who hasn't experienced it can quite believe. The way a second can become something elastic, something that stretches and distorts around the edges of catastrophe. The vehicle jumped the curb. Ethan's head snapped up. Later, if you asked him what he thought in those first fractions of a second, he would struggle to answer. Not because he didn't remember, because there was nothing to remember. There was no thought. There was only his body already moving, already off the curb, already crossing the street in a dead sprint, already covering the distance between himself and her in the way that the body sometimes does things before the mind has issued any instruction at all. She didn't see it coming. She was still looking at her phone. He hit her at full speed, driving his shoulder into hers, wrapping his arms around her and carrying both of them sideways and down onto the pavement as the SUV tore past, missing her by inches. And missing him by less than that, clipping his left leg with enough force to send a shock of white pain up through his hip and spine. They landed hard. He took most of it. His left side, his shoulder, his face turned at the last moment to keep from slamming the pavement head first. The woman was beneath him. She made a short, sharp sound of shock, hands flying up instinctively. The SUV crashed into the building's concrete entrance barrier 30 feet away and stopped. 2 men got out. Ethan was already pushing himself up, putting himself between her and the men, without knowing anything about who they were or what was happening, driven by nothing more sophisticated than the primitive understanding that she was down and they were coming. The first shot caught him in the upper right shoulder. He felt it as impact before he felt it as pain. He staggered, but didn't fall. He turned his body further, widening his coverage of her. The second shot caught him in the side. That one dropped him. He went down to one knee, then to both, then to his hands. The pavement was very cold. He was aware of screaming somewhere, multiple voices, and of running footsteps, and of the sound the SUV made backing up and accelerating away. He was aware of hands on him, not rough hands, uncertain ones. "Hey!" A voice. Female. Close. "Hey, look at me! Look at me right now!" He tried. His vision had developed a quality problem, a grainy, dimming at the edges. "I've got you," the voice said, and there was something in it that surprised him even through the pain. Not the practiced calm of someone trained for crisis, but the raw, cracked quality of someone choosing to hold it together by force of will alone. "Stay here. I've got you. Help is coming." He wanted to say something useful, probably. He opened his mouth. What came out was Sophie's name. Then the pavement rushed up, and the morning went gray, and he was gone. Cheat. The last thing he was aware of, in that space between consciousness and not, was a hand gripping his. Tight, not letting go. He didn't know whose hand it was. He held on anyway. The ambulance reached the scene in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The paramedics would later say it was one of the closest calls they'd seen in years. Not because of the bullets alone, but because of the angle, the blood loss, the way he had positioned himself in falling. Like he'd been trying, even unconscious, to stay between the danger and someone else. He was 32 years old. He had $23 in his wallet. He had a daughter who believed her daddy could fix anything. And somewhere in the chaos of that morning, a woman who controlled $4 billion sat on a blood-stained sidewalk, holding a stranger's hand, and for the first time in a very long time, felt completely, terrifyingly human. The hand was still there when he surfaced. Not metaphorically, literally. When Ethan Walker clawed his way back toward consciousness through what felt like climbing a wall of wet concrete, The first physical sensation he registered, before the pain, before the lights, before the smell of antiseptic that told him exactly where he was the pressure of fingers wrapped around his right hand. Firm, deliberate, like someone had made a decision to hold on and wasn't interested in revisiting it. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was white and institutional and flickered slightly under fluorescent light. There was a rhythmic beeping somewhere to his left that he identified, slowly, as a heart monitor. His own, presumably, which meant his heart was still doing what it was supposed to do, which felt like modest good news. He turned his head, which cost him more than he expected. The pain arrived then, fully and without apology. A deep, grinding pressure in his right shoulder and a sharper, meaner thing in his left side that caught fire the moment he moved and made him exhale hard through clenched teeth. "Don't," said a voice. "Don't try to sit up." He hadn't been trying to sit up. He'd been trying to see who was holding his hand. She was sitting in the chair pulled close to the right side of his bed, and she looked nothing like she had on the sidewalk. On the sidewalk, she had been composed, controlled, the architecture of competence held together under pressure. Here she looked like someone who had spent several hours not allowing herself to fall apart, which is a different thing from being together, and the difference showed. Her hair was partly undone. The neat knot she'd been wearing had surrendered enough strands that it was more suggestion than structure. There was dried blood on the cuff of her coat, which she was still wearing. Her eyes were dark and very direct, and had the slightly too wide quality of someone running on adrenaline residue and not much else. She was still holding his hand. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected, scraped and low. "Hey," she said back. No warmth exactly, but not cold either. Something more complicated, something that hadn't decided what it was yet. "You're the woman from—" "Yes." He processed that for a moment. "You stayed." She didn't answer immediately. Her jaw shifted slightly, the way people's do when they're working out what the honest answer cost them. "You said a name," she finally said, "before you lost consciousness. I couldn't leave without knowing who it was." He stared at her. "Sophie," he said. Something moved across her face, quick, there and gone. "Your daughter?" "Yeah." He tried to swallow. His throat was dry enough to hurt. "How long have I—" 11 hours. It's just past 6 in the evening." She reached for a cup with a straw on the tray beside him and held it toward him without ceremony, the way someone does when they've been sitting beside a hospital bed long enough to figure out the geography of it. He drank. The water was room temperature and tasted extraordinary. "Where is she?" His voice was already steadying, the alarm cutting through the pain the way it always did when it was about Sophie. "Who has her? Does she know?" "She's safe." The woman said it quickly, with the specific certainty of someone who had taken steps to make it true. "I had someone pick her up from school. She's with a woman named—" She consulted her phone, which she had produced from somewhere, "Donna, who apparently works at the front office and knows your daughter by name, and said, and I'm quoting here, that Sophie said to tell you she finished her math homework and that you owe her a chocolate milk." Ethan stared at the ceiling. He felt something move through him that started as relief and arrived, after a moment of travel, somewhere close to the edge of tears, which he had not expected and did not especially want an audience for. He pressed his lips together, breathed. "Okay," he said. "Not to her, just to the room." "Okay," she agreed quietly. There was a pause that stretched long enough to become its own kind of conversation. The monitor beeped. Somewhere down the hall, someone was being paged. The fluorescent light continued its faint, indifferent flicker. "I'm Ethan," he said. "I know. Your ID was in your wallet." A beat. "I'm Isabella Sterling." "I know," he said. "The building had your name on it." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "I suppose it does." He shifted slightly and immediately regretted it. The pain in his side flared white and mean, and he made a sound he hadn't intended to make. Her grip on his hand tightened reflexively, which she seemed to notice a moment later because she started to pull back. He didn't let go. Not because of anything sentimental, just because moving his arm to release her hand required effort he didn't currently have. "The doctor was in while you were under," she said, settling back into the chair. The shoulder wound went through cleanly, missed the subclavian artery by about a centimeter, which the surgeon described as, quote, uncomfortably close. The bullet in your side cracked 2 ribs and did some damage to the tissue, but it didn't hit anything vital. You also have a hairline fracture in your left tibia, probably from the vehicle impact. She paused. You're going to need surgery on the shoulder tomorrow morning. The side wound is stitched and stable. He absorbed this inventory quietly. 2 bullets and a fractured leg. He had a thought, very briefly, about the medical bills that this would generate, and then he put that thought in a box and closed the box and put the box somewhere he could find it later when he had more capacity to be terrified. Was anyone else hurt? He asked. 2 bystanders with minor injuries from the crash. One of my assistants has a broken wrist. She was caught by the door when it... Isabella stopped. Her voice had developed a slight tension in it, the way a wire does when pulled. She reset. Everyone else is physically okay. Physically. He noted the word. He didn't push on it. The men who... One in custody. One still at large as of 2 hours ago. Her expression did something careful and controlled. The police will want to speak with you when you're able. There's a detective assigned to the case. His name is Reyes. He came by earlier and I told him tomorrow, at the earliest. You told him? I told him tomorrow. No apology. Just statement of fact the way someone speaks who is accustomed to decisions landing where she puts them. You'd been out of surgery for 40 minutes. He can wait. Ethan looked at her for a moment. She looked back without flinching, without explaining herself further. There was a quality to her stillness that he couldn't quite classify. Not comfortable stillness, not the kind that comes from ease. More like the stillness of someone who has learned to keep very quiet in the center of turbulent things. Like a person who has survived weather by reducing their surface area. My leg's going to be a problem, he said. I have a crew that needs... I've spoken with your site manager. She said it in the tone of someone who has handled 8 things while you were unconscious and is not interested in being thanked for it. A man named Ray Dominguez. Your position is secured for when you're ready to return. He said, again she consulted the phone, and again, I'm quoting, tell him to stop being a hero and get better, and that the 3rd floor drainage is handled and he doesn't need to worry about it. Ethan blinked. You called Ray. I called Ray. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know what to do with any of this, with the woman sitting in the chair beside him like she'd appointed herself to the position, with the way she'd stayed, with the blood on her coat cuff that she hadn't bothered to change, with the hand she was still technically holding. You don't have to be here, he said. Not unkindly. She was quiet for a moment. I know. I mean, you probably have things. You run a company. You have... Ethan. She said his name the way people say names when they want you to stop talking. Direct. A little tired. I know I don't have to be here. The beeping continued. Down the hall, someone laughed. A nurse, probably, at the station. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary hospital evening, going on around the extraordinary thing that had happened to 2 people who were trying to figure out what it meant. You want to know something strange? She said, after a while. Sure. I had a board meeting this morning, a full board meeting, $60 million on the line, decision that's been 18 months in the making. Well, she looked at her hands briefly. I haven't thought about it once since this morning. I don't even know what they decided. He watched her. Is that strange to you, or is that the thing that's strange about it? She glanced at him, slightly startled, like he'd caught her at something. Both, she said after a moment. He nodded. He looked back at the ceiling. He was tired in a way that was cellular, down in the scaffolding of him, deep fatigue that the adrenaline had been holding at arm's length but was now showing up in full. But he didn't want to sleep yet. Not quite yet. Tell me about her, Isabella said. Sophie. He turned his head. She was watching him with an expression that was more open than anything she'd shown him so far. The professional composure cracked slightly, something genuine and careful underneath. Why? He asked. Because you said her name when you were bleeding out on a street and didn't know if you were going to make it. A pause. That tells me a lot, but I want to hear the rest. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he talked. He talked about Sophie's socks and her fruit snack trades and her theory about Marcus at school. He talked about the fraction homework and the book about the girl who talked to horses and the way she'd said bye that morning without looking back, and how he was still deciding if that was a good thing. He talked about the second-hand bike. He talked about the bran flakes. He did not talk about Claire. Not yet. That was a different kind of weight, and he wasn't ready to put it down in front of a stranger. But Isabella listened the way people rarely listen, without filling the pauses, without redirecting, without the faint performance of engagement that most people substitute for actual attention. She just listened. Her face did small things in response to what he said. Not reactions she was producing, but the involuntary ones that happen when something actually reaches you. When he stopped, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "She sounds exhausting." He laughed. It hurt. A sharp spike in his side, but it was genuine and unplanned and felt, briefly, like a crack of light through something solid. "She is completely exhausting," he said. "She's also the best thing I've ever done." Isabella looked away at that, toward the window where the Hartford evening was settling into dark blue. Something in her face went briefly private, a door closing, then opening again part way. "I know that feeling," she said, so quietly he almost didn't catch it. He didn't ask what she meant. He filed it. The doctor came in shortly after, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Dr. Chen, who had the economical manner of someone who has explained complex information to frighten people so many times that she has refined it to its essential components. She spoke to Ethan about the surgery scheduled for 9 a.m., about the recovery timeline, about the pain management plan, about the things he needed to watch for in terms of infection and nerve response. She also gave him a look that he interpreted as, "You are extremely lucky to be having this conversation, and I'd prefer you remember that. The shoulder will need 4 to 6 weeks of restricted movement," she said. "The rib injury needs 8 to 10 weeks minimum before any strenuous activity. The leg, how long?" he interrupted. She looked at him with the patience of someone who has heard this exact question. "Full weight bearing, 6 to 8 weeks. But we can get you mobile on crutches faster than that, depending on how the surgery goes." He did the math. 6 weeks minimum out of full physical work. Possibly 8. His portion of the next 2 months' rent was due the 15th. Sophie's medication needed to be refilled in 9 days. The credit card minimum was... He stopped doing the math. The box. He put it back in the box. "Okay," he said. Dr. Chen left. The room was quiet again. "What just happened on your face?" Isabella asked. He looked at her. "What?" "When she gave you the timeline, something happened on your face and you shut it down. What was it?" He considered not answering. He was aware that the dynamic between them was unusual, that a woman he had met approximately 11 hours ago was sitting in a hospital chair beside his bed, having a conversation that felt, improbably, like they'd gotten to the 3rd or 4th conversation instead of the 1st. He was aware that he should probably feel more guarded, more unfamiliar with her. He didn't. He wasn't sure if that was the drugs or the circumstances or something else. "Money," he said. "I was doing math." She didn't react with discomfort. No charitable performance of not noticing, no redirect, just a nod, small and unadorned. "Okay." "I'm going to be fine," he said. "I've been..." He stopped, chose a different word. "I've navigated tight spots before." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't completely decode. "I know you have," she said. A pause. "Ethan, I want to cover the medical expenses." He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not anger exactly, more like something defensive firing up, old and automatic. "No. You were shot saving my life. I know what happened." "Then you understand why." "I understand why you think you should," he said. "I'm telling you no." She looked at him with patience that had an edge under it. "That's not..." "I didn't do it for a transaction," he said. "I saw something happening and I moved. That's it. That's the whole story. If I let you pay my bills because of it, then it becomes something different. It becomes an exchange, and I don't want it to be an exchange." Isabella held his gaze for a moment. She looked like she wanted to argue. The shape of an argument was visible in her expression, practical and already assembled. But she didn't. She exhaled through her nose and looked at the window again. "You're very difficult," she said. "You're not the first person to mention that." Another silence. The heart monitor beeped. The city outside the window had gone dark. "Can I at least make sure Sophie is taken care of for the next few days while you're here?" She said it differently this time. Not a corporate offer. More careful. More human. "A familiar phase, meals, school drop-offs, nothing—" She paused, searching for the right framing. "Nothing that has to mean anything. Just so she's not scared." He looked at the ceiling. He thought about Sophie at Donna's house, or wherever she was, and whether she was scared and whether she was asking questions that Donna didn't know how to answer, and whether she'd eaten, and whether she'd remembered to use her inhaler before bed. "Yeah," he said finally. "Okay. Yeah." Isabella nodded once. She pulled out her phone and sent a message, quick and precise. "Done." They sat for a while in a silence that had gradually lost most of its strangeness. Not comfortable exactly, but no longer charged. Just two people in a room, one of them in a hospital bed, both of them at the end of an extraordinarily long day. He fell asleep sometime around 8:30, without planning to. One moment he was watching the light from the window, and then he was simply gone. Isabella was still in the chair when it happened. She stayed for another 2 hours after that, working through her phone with the sound off, the chair pulled close, before she finally stood, set his hand back carefully on the blanket, and left without waking him. She did not examine why she stayed that long. She had learned, a long time ago, that there were certain things it was better not to examine too directly. The surgery the next morning went without complication, which Dr. Chen described with the careful understatement of someone who had learned not to tempt anything by being too celebratory about outcomes. The shoulder repair took 2.5 hours. Ethan was in recovery by noon. Sophie came to the hospital at 2 o'clock. He heard her before he saw her. The particular frequency of her voice cutting down a hospital hallway, asking someone a question about the equipment on the wall, curious rather than worried, which told him everything he needed to know about how she'd been handled. She appeared in the doorway and stopped. She looked at him, at the bandaging, at the IV line, at the unfamiliar mechanical geography of the hospital room, with those amber eyes taking everything in, calculating. "Dad?" she said. "Hey, Bug." She walked to the bed slowly, not running the way she would have at home, like the hospital had imposed a gravity on her that she was respecting. She stopped beside him and looked at his arm in the sling. "Does it hurt?" "A little." "How much is a little?" "Like a 5 out of 10. She considered this seriously. "What would a 10 be?" "I don't want to find out." She looked at his face. She reached out and put her small hand on top of his, the uninjured hand, the right one, and just held it there. Not squeezing, just contact. "Donna says you were very brave," Sophie said. "Donna is very generous." "Were you brave?" He looked at his daughter. "I just moved fast," he said. "I didn't think about it." Sophie seemed to accept this as a more honest answer than the alternative. She nodded, once the way she did when something made sense to her. Then she looked around the room and noticed Isabella, who was standing near the window with the studied unobtrusiveness of someone trying very hard to take up less space than usual. "Are you the lady?" Sophie asked. Isabella looked slightly caught off guard, a crack in the composure so brief it was almost imperceptible. Yes, I suppose I'm the lady. My dad saved you." "He did." Sophie looked at her with the frank, unfiltered assessment that only children below a certain age can produce without social consequence. She took in the coat and the posture and the general presentation of Isabella Sterling, and whatever conclusion she arrived at, she kept it to herself. "Okay," she said. Then she turned back to Ethan. "Dad, can I press the button on the bed that makes it go up and down?" "Absolutely not." "What if I only do it once?" Still no. "What if—" "Sophie." She subsided. She climbed carefully onto the very edge of the bed and sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm, and she sat there the way she'd sat in the kitchen doorway that morning with her mismatched socks, completely present, completely herself, requiring nothing from him except that he exist. He was, he thought, the luckiest unlucky man in Hartford. He stayed in the hospital for 6 days. 6 days was long enough to develop opinions about the food, which ranged from edible to optimistic. Long enough to figure out which nurses were talkers and which weren't, which he preferred depending on the time of day and how much pain he was in. Long enough for Detective Reyes to come twice. A compact, serious man who smelled faintly of coffee and asked the same questions multiple ways, which Ethan recognized as technique rather than confusion, and take a full account of everything he'd seen on the sidewalk before the impact. "The second man," Reyes said on the second visit. "You said he was standing against the building on the north side of 9th. Still, not moving with the foot traffic, just watching her. Can you describe him?" Ethan did. He had a good memory for these things. It was part of what made him effective on a job site, the ability to absorb a scene and hold the relevant details. Height, jacket color, the way the man held himself. He'd only had maybe 4 seconds of observation, but he gave Reyes what he had. The detective wrote without speaking for a moment. Then, "Did you know who she was before?" "No, I saw the building, but I didn't connect it." I just saw what was happening and moved." He said it the same way he'd said it to Sophie, because it was the truth, and because the truth was the simplest available. Reyes studied him for a moment with the slightly skeptical attention of someone whose job involves being lied to fairly regularly. He seemed to decide Ethan was telling the truth. "Okay," he said. "Isabella came every day. Not always for long, sometimes only 20 minutes. She had a company to run, meetings that couldn't be fully relocated to a hospital waiting room, decisions that required her actual physical presence. But she came. She would sit in the chair she had apparently claimed, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and the silences between them continued to have less electricity in them, and more of something quieter and harder to name. On the third day she brought work, spread documents across the small table near the window, and worked through them with a focus that was slightly aggressive, the way she attacked things when she was processing something she wasn't ready to process directly. He watched her from the bed. She had a habit of pressing 2 fingers against her temple when she was reading something dense, and she moved through the papers with a speed that suggested she'd been doing this long enough that the volume no longer intimidated her, only annoyed her. "What is it?" he asked. "Supply chain problem. One of my overseas distributors is trying to renegotiate a contract we closed 8 months ago. Can they do that? Not if they want to keep the contract. But they're trying. They're trying." She made a note, moved to the next document. "People always try things," she said, with a flatness that was not cynicism exactly, but had been shaped by it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you been running it, the company?" "Officially, 7 years. Effectively, longer." She turned a page. "My father built the original construction division. I came in for the financial side. I studied economics and corporate law, worked in finance for 4 years before he asked me to come back and help restructure. We expanded into real estate development, logistics, a few technology acquisitions." She shrugged slightly, a small economical movement. "It grew." "That's an understatement." "Most stories are, when you compress them." He thought about that. "What was it you wanted to do before the company?" She stopped writing. A brief but complete stop. Then she resumed. "Why do you ask that?" "You said officially and effectively. Like there was a difference between when you started and when you actually started. And you said your father asked you, not that you decided." The writing stopped again, longer this time. She set down the pen and looked at him with an expression that he was beginning to be able to read, not read completely, but read the category of. This was the expression she wore when she'd been caught being more specific than she'd intended. "Architecture," she said finally. "I wanted to study architecture." He let that land without commenting on the obvious resonance of it. A woman who'd wanted to design buildings ending up owning them. He thought she didn't need that observation. He thought she'd made it herself, probably many times. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She picked up the pen. "I regret some things," she said. "Not that one. Or, not the way you mean." She paused. "What I built matters." What the company does matters. People have jobs, real ones, good ones. That's not nothing. No, he agreed. That's not nothing. She looked at him for a moment with that particular slight open quality she occasionally let through. You're easy to talk to, she said, like it surprised her, like it was a finding she wasn't sure what to do with. People say that, he said. I think it's because I'm not trying to get anything. She considered that. Then she went back to the supply chain problem, and he stared at the ceiling, and they stayed like that, in the particular comfortable uselessness of a hospital afternoon, until the dinner tray arrived and he made one comment about the quality of the green beans that made her laugh. A real one, short and surprised, the kind that escapes rather than being offered. And then they ate, sort of, him from the tray and her from a container that had arrived with one of her assistants. And it was domestic in a way that neither of them acknowledged directly, because to acknowledge it would have made it strange, and it wasn't strange, it was just ordinary. Surprisingly, improbably ordinary. On the 5th day, she talked about Marcus, not the boy from Sophie's school, her husband. She did it sideways, which was the only way Ethan had come to understand she did difficult things, not frontal approaches, not announced disclosures. She came at the hard things from an angle, almost like she was checking if she could get close to them before committing to it. She had been talking about something administrative, the restructuring of one of her regional offices, and she said something about timing, about how the decision had been delayed because it had coincided with a period when she hadn't been functional, she said, using the word with a kind of clinical distance. And then she stopped and said very evenly, my husband died 3 years ago. Cancer. Pancreatic. He was 41. Ethan did not say he was sorry. He'd been on the receiving end of enough of those to know they were meant to comfort the speaker as much as the receiver. Instead, he said, what was his name? She looked at him. Whatever she'd expected, it hadn't been that. Marcus, she said. A beat. How long were you together? He asked. 8 years, married for 5. She was looking at the window. Not the view, just a direction that wasn't him. He was a civil engineer. We met at a conference. He was presenting a paper on sustainable urban drainage systems, and I was there because my father made me go, and I stood in the back of the room thinking the presentation was the driest thing I'd ever heard, and then afterwards someone introduced us, and he was... She stopped. A small pause that carried weight. He was the least boring person I'd ever met. It was unfair. You shouldn't be able to present that dryly and then be that interesting up close. Ethan almost smiled. Sounds like Sophie's fraction problem. She glanced at him, confused for a half-second, and then she got it. The thing that seems backward from how it sounds, and something moved across her face that was still not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, close enough that the distinction stopped mattering much. Yeah, she said softly. Like that. They were quiet for a while. I tried everything, she said eventually. Every specialist, every trial, every option that had any evidence behind it. Spent, she shook her head slightly, a number that I don't say out loud anymore. Not because it's too large, but because it stopped feeling like it meant anything. Money didn't feel like enough, he said. Not a question. Money was never going to be enough. I knew that. Her jaw worked. I couldn't stop trying anyway. Because stopping felt like giving up, he said. Like deciding, she corrected quietly. Like saying, this is where it ends, and I wasn't willing to be the one who said that. He understood that. He understood it more specifically and thoroughly than he could explain without telling her things he hadn't told her yet. I know, he said. She looked at him. My wife, he said. Claire, 4 years ago, car accident. And there it was. The thing he'd been carrying around the edges of for 5 days finally set down, gently, in the space between them. He watched her take it in, watched her understand. Sophie's mother, she said. Yeah. A long silence. She sounds like she was, Isabella started. She was, he said, simply, completely. Isabella nodded. She did not say she was sorry. He noticed that. He appreciated it more than he could have explained. Outside, the Hartford evening was doing what Hartford evenings did in autumn, cooling fast and completely, the kind of dark that meant the season had made its decision. Somewhere down the hall, the hospital continued its indifferent, efficient work. Machines monitored, nurses checked. Somewhere, people were arriving and people were leaving, and the ordinary traffic of living and not living moved through the building with the rhythm it always had. In room 318, two people who had both learned to be alone in the middle of crowds sat with the particular stillness of those who have just put something down that they had been carrying for a very long time. Not healed, not close to it, not suddenly, improbably fixed by proximity. Just less alone, in this one room, on this one evening. That was enough. That was, for now, exactly enough. He was discharged on the morning of the 6th day, walking out on crutches with Sophie holding the door and Isabella standing beside the car she'd arranged, and Ray Dominguez showing up unannounced with a duffel bag of things from the job site that he wordlessly handed over, gave Ethan one long look that communicated everything, said, "Don't be stupid about the recovery," and left. Ethan stood on the sidewalk in the November air, on crutches, with his daughter pressed against his good side, and a woman he'd known for 6 days standing a few feet away with her hands in her coat pockets, and an expression he was beginning to know. He looked at Hartford. He looked at the ordinary city going about its ordinary morning. He was 32 years old. He had walked out of a hospital on 2 feet, which was not a given. He had a daughter who was warm and intact and apparently owed him a chocolate milk. He had a job to go back to. He looked sideways at Isabella, briefly. He wasn't sure yet what he had there. Something. The shape of something that hadn't declared itself yet. "Okay," he said, to no one and everyone. The same word he'd used in the hospital room when the relief hit him too directly to manage with anything more articulate. "Okay," Sophie said, already looking at the car, and clearly calculating whether she could ask to sit in the front seat. She absolutely could not. He told her so before she asked. She asked anyway. The crutches lasted 3 weeks before Ethan started leaving them propped against the wall and walking without them, which Dr. Chen had explicitly told him not to do before week 6. He told himself it was practical. The apartment was small enough that the crutches were more obstacle than aid, that navigating the narrow kitchen with them was a geometric problem with no good solution. He told himself this, and it was partially true, and partially the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent 4 years managing everything alone and found dependency, even temporary and medically warranted dependency, deeply uncomfortable in a way he didn't fully examine. Sophie noticed immediately. "Dr. Chen said 6 weeks, she said, from the kitchen table, without looking up from her homework. "Dr. Chen doesn't live here. I'm going to tell her." "You don't have her number." Sophie looked up. "Miss Isabella does." Ethan paused. This was accurate. Isabella had exchanged numbers with Dr. Chen at some point during the hospital stay. He wasn't entirely sure when, in the efficient, unannounced way that Isabella handled logistical problems, which was to simply solve them before informing anyone that there had been a problem to solve. "Don't tell Miss Isabella," he said. "Then use the crutches." He used the crutches. This was the shape of his life in November. The apartment on Caldwell Street, slightly reorganized. Sophie had moved the coffee table without being asked, creating a wider path from the bedroom to the bathroom, which he pretended not to notice because noticing it would have required him to have a feeling about it that he wasn't prepared to have in front of her. The job site on hold, on Ray checking in every few days with updates that were professionally worded and personally gentle, which was Ray's particular gift, the ability to communicate care through the medium of logistics. And Isabella. She came on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, which had begun as a pattern he hadn't agreed to, but had simply found himself inside, the way you find yourself inside certain weather. She would arrive at 2 or 2:30, after whatever her morning had consumed, and she would sit at the kitchen table, the same chair every time, which he noted without commenting on, and sometimes she brought work and sometimes she didn't, and Sophie would be at school until 3:15, and they had that hour, sometimes a little more, that existed in a category neither of them had named. They talked about things that were not the shooting, mostly. Not because it was avoided, they had covered it, carefully, in the hospital, the way you cover ground that needs to be covered before you can build on it, but because there was more. More to say about everything else, which was itself surprising. The discovery that a billionaire CEO and a construction foreman from Caldwell Street had this much accumulated material to get through. She told him about the early years of the Sterling Group's expansion, the deals that fell through, and the ones that shouldn't have gone through and did, and the 2 years of 30-hour weeks that she now thought had been less about ambition and more about having something to fill every available space with so that nothing else could get in. He listened without nodding too much. She appreciated that about him, the quality of his attention. Most people listened with their response already loading. Ethan listened like the response hadn't started forming yet. He told her about the construction side of things, not the financial struggle, not the bills, those he kept in the box for now, but the actual work. The satisfaction of a foundation poured right. The particular frustration of a site where the architect had drawn something beautiful and structurally impractical, and the crew had to find the translation. He talked about it with a specificity and a genuine engagement that made her pay attention in a different way, the way you pay attention when you realize someone knows their thing, really knows it, down to the texture of it. "You could teach this," she said one afternoon. "Teach construction? The decision-making part? The reading a situation and finding the actual problem part. That's not a trade skill. That's... A lot of executives pay consultants significant money to develop that ability, and most of them never actually get there." He shrugged, slightly uncomfortable, the way he was when compliments got too specific. "I just do what makes sense. That's what everyone says when they're good at something they've never had to explain." He looked at her. "Is that what you tell yourself about running a $4 billion company?" "No," she said, without missing a beat. "I know exactly what I do and how I do it. I've had to explain it too many times." A pause. "Which is how I know you know what you do. You just haven't been asked to articulate it." He was quiet for a moment. "No one's asked." "I'm asking." It came out slightly more direct than he expected, slightly more present, and they were both aware of that, the small shift in register. He held her gaze for a second longer than strictly conversational. Then he looked at his coffee cup. "I'll think about it," he said. She went back to her laptop. He went back to his coffee. Outside the window, November was being aggressively itself. Sophie came home at 3:15 and changed the weather of the room, the way Sophie always did, by arriving with a volume and specificity of energy that reorganized everything else around it. She dropped her backpack with a sound that suggested it contained rocks, pulled off her coat in a single spinning motion that deposited it approximately in the direction of the hook by the door, and announced without prelude, "Isabella, did you know that dolphins sleep with one eye open?" Isabella looked up from her laptop. "I did not know that. It's called unihemispheric slow-wave sleep. I looked it up. Why were you looking up dolphin sleep? We're supposed to write a fun fact for Friday's Share Circle, and I wanted something good. Marcus was going to say his dog can sneeze on command, but that's not even that impressive because lots of dogs can do that." Sophie pulled herself up into her regular chair with the usual mountaineering effort. "I think dolphins are better." "I think dolphins are significantly better," Isabella agreed with the gravity the question deserved. Ethan watched this from the other side of the table. The two of them had arrived at an understanding over the past several weeks that he had not facilitated or arranged, that had simply developed with the organic logic of a Sophie-related thing, which was to say, Sophie had decided she liked Isabella and had begun treating her accordingly, which meant with a combination of complete acceptance and absolutely no deference whatsoever. Isabella, for her part, handled Sophie the way she handled most things that surprised her, by paying close attention and adapting, efficiently but without performing it. She did not talk down to her. She did not perform delight. She answered questions seriously, pushed back when Sophie said something that wasn't quite right, and occasionally asked her things with the genuine curiosity of someone who had spent years in rooms full of adults and found the perspective genuinely interesting. Sophie, who was constitutionally allergic to condescension, received this well. What Ethan noticed, and it landed in him quietly, without drama, in the way that the significant things were arriving lately, was that Isabella was easier with Sophie than she was with most things. The control that she maintained so thoroughly in most contexts loosened slightly around an 8-year-old who wanted to talk about dolphin sleep patterns. It wasn't that Sophie disarmed her. It was more like Sophie didn't trigger whatever it was that made Isabella's defenses necessary, and so they didn't come up, and what was underneath them was lighter, more native to her, something closer to who she might have been before everything that had asked her to be something harder. He filed this observation carefully. He was accumulating a lot of filed observations about Isabella Sterling. The problem with filing observations, he was beginning to understand, was that eventually the file got full. It was the last week of November, a Wednesday, when the thing that had been developing its shape for weeks finally declared itself, and it did it in the least dramatic way possible, which was probably right, because the things that actually matter rarely arrive with appropriate ceremony. He had been trying to reach a can on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet. The crutches were propped against the counter, and he was balanced on his good leg and his recovery leg, which had improved enough that he could stand without them for short periods, but not enough that he should have been stretching for overhead things while doing it, which he knew and was doing anyway because the can was right there. He overreached. His left leg took too much weight, and the pain spike was brief but sharp, and he made a sound and grabbed the counter, and Isabella, who had been at the kitchen table behind him, was beside him before he fully registered she'd moved. "I've got it," she said. "I'm fine." "You made a sound." "It's nothing. Ethan." Her hand was on his arm, steadying, not hovering, and she was close, closer than she'd been outside of the hospital, and he was gripping the counter, and they were both very still for a moment in that narrow kitchen where you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out. "I'm fine," he said again, quieter this time. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her expression, complicated, layered, arriving in the wrong order. She took a half step back. Her hand didn't move from his arm. "The can," she said. "What? What were you trying to reach?" He looked at the shelf. "The soup, the one on the left." She reached up and got it, easily, and set it on the counter, and they stood there in the narrow kitchen with the soup between them and something that had been building for weeks pressing against the inside of the moment. She stepped back fully. He let go of the counter. "Thank you," he said. "You shouldn't be reaching overhead yet." "I know." "So why?" "Because," he said, and stopped. And the reason he stopped was that the actual answer, because asking for help with the soup can felt like one more thing he couldn't manage on his own, one more small indignity of a recovery that was costing him in ways that had nothing to do with his shoulder. The actual answer was more than the conversation had asked for. Isabella looked at him with the expression she got when she'd understood something before he finished saying it. "Right," she said quietly. She went back to the table. He opened the soup. The moment folded itself back into the ordinary shape of the afternoon, and they let it, both of them, by mutual and unspoken agreement, deciding that the file wasn't quite full yet, that they weren't quite ready. But it was close. December arrived, and with it the specific misery of a Hartford winter, gray, committed, the kind of cold that didn't bother making a point of itself, just settled into everything and stayed. The heating in the Caldwell Street apartment had a philosophy that Ethan described as aspirational, meaning it aspired to adequacy without reliably achieving it, and he'd put a second blanket on Sophie's bed in early November, which she'd immediately named Gerald and become attached to. He went back to the job site in early December, limited duty, desk work, oversight, the kind of presence that Ray needed even if Ethan's body wasn't fully operational yet. Ray looked at him on the first day back with an expression that combined relief and irritation in the specific ratio of a man whose life had been more complicated in someone's absence. "You're 3 weeks early," Ray said. "I'm on limited duty." "You think I don't know what limited duty means?" "Limited duty means you stand there and point at things and don't lift anything heavier than a clipboard." "I can do that." "I know you can do that. I've been doing that for the last 3 weeks. Ray squinted at him. "You look like hell." "Thank you, Ray." "How's the shoulder?" "Functional." "That's not what I asked." "It's what I've got." Ray made a sound that communicated everything he thought about that answer and handed Ethan a clipboard, and they walked the site together, Ray talking and Ethan listening and occasionally making notes, and within 40 minutes they were back to the ordinary language of the job, which was Ethan's preferred language, the one he'd always been most fluent in, and something in him settled that hadn't been fully settled since the morning on 9th Street. He was, he realized, someone who needed to be useful, not in the performative sense, in the structural sense, like a load-bearing beam that develops stress when it isn't carrying what it was designed to carry. 4 weeks of enforced passivity had cost him something that wasn't just income. He told Isabella this on Thursday, which had remained a Thursday without either of them officially reinstating it. "That makes sense," she said. She was sitting across the kitchen table from him, both of them with coffee. Sophie at a sleepover at a classmate's house. A first, something Ethan had only agreed to after approximately 15 minutes of assurance from the other parent that yes, Sophie's inhaler information had been received, and yes, they had the doctor's number. "You don't think it's a pride thing?" he asked. "Why does it have to be a pride thing? You're someone who provides. That's not a character flaw. That's a shape. People have shapes. When you force them into a different one for too long, something gets bent." He looked at her. "What's your shape?" She considered it seriously, which he appreciated. She didn't deflect with a joke or give him the boardroom version. She actually thought about it. "Control," she said finally. Not the need to dominate, more the need for things to be orderly." "Understood. I need to be able to see the whole board. When I can't see the whole board, I don't function well." "Is that why the shooting was hard, specifically?" She looked at her coffee cup. "The shooting was hard for several reasons," she said carefully. "But yes, that's part of it. Someone had planned something, had moved pieces around a board I wasn't even looking at, and had gotten close enough to—" She stopped. "Reset. I don't like not seeing things coming." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Who do they think did it?" "The police. Reyes hasn't told me anything in 2 weeks." She sat back in the chair, and her expression shifted into something more controlled, more deliberate. He recognized this. The pivot from personal to professional, the slight squaring up of posture. "There's a man named Conrad Voss," she said. "He's a developer. Our paths have crossed professionally for about 5 years. He made a bid on a portfolio of commercial properties in the Northeast that I acquired instead, about 8 months ago. He also made overtures about a merger 18 months ago that I declined. Declined meaning I told him the terms were structured to be disadvantageous to my shareholders, and the answer was no, and I wasn't interested in renegotiating." She said it with the flatness of someone describing a decision that had seemed completely obvious at the time. He didn't receive that well. How not well? There were communications through lawyers, formal but pointed, and then a period of quiet. Her jaw shifted slightly. "The police believe the man in custody is connected to Voss's organization. They're building the case." Ethan processed this. "So someone tried to have you killed because of a real estate deal. And a merger. And probably other things I'm less aware of." She said it without drama, with the measured tone of someone who has had several weeks to sit with a fact that should be more shocking than it feels by now. "That's the world I operate in. I knew it was a possibility, in the abstract. You know things are possible without believing they'll happen. Until they do. Until they do." She looked at him directly. "Which is when I found out that a man I'd never met was willing to run across a street and take a bullet to make sure it didn't happen to me." The kitchen was quiet. The heating system made its aspirational effort somewhere in the walls. "I wasn't thinking about bullets," he said. "I didn't see the gun until later." I know. Something in her voice had thinned slightly, the way a voice does when it's carrying more weight than the words "it's moving." That somehow makes it worse and better at the same time. He understood that, both sides of it. "Ethan." She said his name with a particular weight that meant she had decided to say something she'd been deciding about for a while. He looked at her. "I want to offer you something, and I need you to actually hear it before you respond." He felt the familiar tightening, but held it. "Okay." "Sterling Group has a construction division, regional projects mostly, but we're expanding. The division manager position has been open for 4 months. I've interviewed 8 candidates, and none of them have—" She paused, chose the word carefully, "the actual ground-level competence the role requires. They have credentials, they have management experience. They don't know what to do when the concrete pour is wrong, and the architect is in an office 2 states away, and the crew is standing around waiting for a decision." He was very still. "The salary is $140 to start," she said. "Benefits, including full medical for you and Sophie. The role would have you overseeing project management across 3 regional sites initially, expanding to 6 within 18 months if—" "Isabella, let me finish. This is because of the shooting. She looked at him with an expression that was, briefly, impatient in a way that was almost affectionate. This is because I have a division that needs a manager who actually knows construction, and you are someone who actually knows construction, and who also happens to have the kind of judgment and communication ability that I have been trying to hire for 4 months and failing. She held his gaze. The shooting is the reason I know you exist. That's the only thing the shooting is in this equation. He looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked at the water stain on the ceiling that he still hadn't reported. $140,000. Full medical. Sophie's asthma medication no longer a line item in a spreadsheet that required other line items to shrink to accommodate it. His own dental appointment, overdue by a year and a half. The box he'd been managing for 4 years. Not eliminated, but significantly less dangerous. He could feel the weight of it, the shape of what it would mean. I need to think about it, he said. She nodded. I know, I'm not... She stopped. Take the time you need. Why is it that every time you offer me something and I resist, you don't push? She tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Most people, when they want something, when they think they're right, they push. You make the offer and then you wait. He looked at her. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Because pushing makes people defensive, and defensive people make decisions from the wrong place. A pause. And because I've been pushed into things before, I know what that produces. The architecture conversation, her father asking her to come back. He remembered. He nodded slowly. Okay. Okay, you'll think about it. Okay, I understand why you do it. She almost smiled. He thought about the job offer for 4 days. He thought about it the way he thought about structural problems, from multiple angles, testing the load-bearing points, looking for where the weakness was. Because there was a complexity here that went beyond the practical, and he knew it, and she probably knew it, and neither of them had said it directly. The complexity was this: the distance between accepting a job from someone and being in some way dependent on them, professionally, financially, structurally, and whatever else was developing between them in that narrow kitchen on Thursday afternoons. He wasn't naive about what was in the file. He wasn't naive about what she felt, or what he felt, or about the fact that both of them were too careful and too damaged to have named it yet. But naming it was one thing, and building a situation where the financial and the personal were tangled together was something else. Something that could compromise both. Something that could put him in a position he'd spent his entire adult life making sure he was never in, which was owing something to someone he also cared about. He talked to Ray about it. Ray listened with his usual squint and the expression of a man who was going to give his actual opinion whether asked or not. When Ethan finished, Ray was quiet for about 5 seconds. Let me ask you something, Ray said. Okay? If she was a man, if it was some guy who ran a construction company and saw you work and offered you this, would you spend 4 days worrying about it? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. Because if you're not taking this job because you don't want to owe a woman you like something, that's... Ray made a face. That's a thing you should probably look at. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside the site, a delivery truck was backing up, producing its periodic beeping. Ordinary sight sounds, the texture of every day of his working life. She's not just a woman I like, he said carefully. It's complicated. Complicated is for people who can afford to be complicated, Ray said, with the bluntness of someone who has been in construction for 22 years and has limited patience for overthinking. You have a kid with asthma and a credit card balance and a shoulder that's going to need physical therapy that your current benefits don't fully cover. The job sounds right for you, and the money is real. He shrugged. The complicated stuff will be complicated whether you take it or not. Might as well have good insurance while you figure it out. This was not poetry. It was not particularly nuanced. It was, Ethan thought, almost certainly correct. He called Isabella that evening. I'll take it, he said when she picked up. A pause. Okay. I have conditions. Of course you do. I want to be evaluated on performance the same way any other division manager would be. No cushion. If I'm not what you need in the role, you tell me and we handle it like a professional situation. Agreed. And the other thing, he paused, whatever this is. He didn't specify. He didn't have to. It doesn't live inside the work. It's separate. It has to be separate. Silence on the line. He could hear her breathing and the faint ambient sound of wherever she was. An office, probably, still at 8 in the evening, because that was apparently who she was. Yes, she said, I agree. Okay? Okay. A beat. Thank you, Ethan. Don't thank me yet. I might be terrible at it. You won't be. You don't know that. I know exactly that, she said, with a certainty that was so complete and unperformed that he felt it in his chest in a way he didn't immediately know what to do with. He said goodnight and hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the apartment, Sophie asleep, the heating system doing its best, the water stain on the ceiling unchanged. He thought about Claire. He did it on purpose, not the late-night version that had reach and danger, but the daytime version, the one that was more like a conversation with a memory than a wound. He thought about what she had been and what she would have said, which he could hear clearly still, 4 years and 2 months, and however many days later, in the specific register of her voice. She would have said, about time. She would have been direct about it and slightly impatient and correct, because that had been Claire, cutting through the thing he was making complicated to the simple thing underneath it. He stayed at the table until 10. Then he brushed his teeth and went to bed and for once didn't fight the direction his thoughts wanted to go. He started at Sterling Group in January. The transition had a rough first week, which he had expected. Not because the work was unfamiliar. The work was deeply familiar. It was just scaled differently, with more administrative layers and more variables to track simultaneously. The rough part was the people, specifically the people who had been in the division before him, who had their own sense of how things should run and were not immediately convinced that a man who'd come in from a mid-sized Hartford construction outfit was going to improve that. There was a project coordinator named Derek who made his skepticism visible in the particular way of someone confident enough in his position to let it show. He was mid-30s, sharp, had been with Sterling Group for 3 years, and he managed his resistance through the medium of process, asking for more documentation than necessary, routing decisions through additional approval layers that technically existed but had never been consistently used, arriving at meetings with the expression of a man taking notes for a future argument. Ethan recognized this. He'd seen versions of it on every site he'd ever run. The form it took changed. The structure underneath it didn't. He didn't address it directly. He learned Derek's actual areas of expertise, which were considerable. The man was genuinely good at vendor management and scheduling, better than anyone else on the team. And he began routing the decisions that required those skills specifically to Derek. And when the work was good, he said so clearly and publicly, and when it wasn't, he said so privately and specifically, without theater. By the end of the 3rd week, Derek was doing the thing good people eventually do when they realize the new person isn't a threat to their competence, but an actual leader, which is to say, he started doing his actual job. The site work itself was satisfying in a way that was slightly unexpected in its scale. Sterling Group's division was managing 4 projects simultaneously, ranging from a mid-rise commercial renovation similar to what he'd done at Meridian to a much larger residential development outside the city that had been running behind schedule for 6 months before he arrived. He spent his first 2 weeks on the residential site, walking it the way he walked every site. From the ground up, listening more than talking. He found the problem on day 9. It wasn't the schedule, which everyone had been focused on. The schedule was a symptom. The actual problem was a subcontractor whose work on the foundation drainage had been signed off at 2 separate inspection points in ways that, when Ethan looked at the documentation carefully, seemed to have skipped the middle step. He pulled the crew lead, pulled the original specs, and spent an afternoon going over the discrepancy. The short version was, the drainage was wrong, not catastrophically, but significantly, and doing it right now was going to cost less than doing it right after the concrete pour, and definitely less than doing it right after the building was occupied, and the problem became a litigation. He brought it to Isabella in a meeting that also included her head of legal and her CFO, presented the problem, the documentation, and 3 options for addressing it with cost estimates for each. He was clear, and he was brief, and he didn't editorialize. Isabella listened. The CFO looked alarmed. The head of legal asked 3 questions that Ethan answered directly. Isabella said, "Option 2? Move on it this week." The CFO started to say something about the budget impact. Isabella gave him a look that Ethan had not yet seen directed at him personally, but recognized immediately as the full-weight version of who she was. Not unkind, not performed, just complete and final in the way that gravity is complete and final. The CFO stopped talking. "Option 2, she said again. "Ethan, what do you need?" What he needed, he told her. She arranged it. The meeting was over in 23 minutes. Driving home that evening, he'd gotten a second-hand car 2 weeks into the job, a practical decision that had felt almost surreal in its normalcy, choosing a car like a regular person. He thought about what Ray had said, about the complicated stuff being complicated whether or not you take the job. He thought about what it was like to work for her, the clarity of it. The way she made decisions without the performance that so many people in authority positions substituted for actual decision-making. The deliberating out loud, the gathering of opinions for the purpose of appearing collaborative, the delay that masqueraded as diligence. Isabella decided things, with good information and a clear head, and then she moved. He found this, professionally, deeply refreshing in the way that only people who have worked under indecisive leadership can fully appreciate. He pulled up to Caldwell Street, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the car. Through the window of the apartment, he could see the kitchen light. Sophie was in there, doing homework or eating, or most likely doing both simultaneously, which he told her not to do, and which she did every single time without apparent guilt. He sat in the car in the dark on Caldwell Street, and he thought, something is changing. Something has been changing for weeks, and the rate of change is increasing, and the direction is clear even if the destination isn't fully visible yet. He was not afraid of it. That was the surprising part. He was 32 years old, and he had been afraid of a fairly long list of things for 4 years. Afraid of not being enough, afraid of the bills, afraid of Sophie getting sick and the insurance not covering it, afraid of the water stain on the ceiling, afraid of the late nights when the grief still had reach. He'd carried the fear the way you carry something heavy for so long that you forget what your arms feel like without it. Something was lightening, slowly, unevenly, without drama. He got out of the car and went inside, and Sophie was in fact doing both, homework and eating crackers, and she'd left crumbs on the math worksheet, which he picked it up, looked at the fraction problem at the bottom, which she'd gotten wrong. Bug. I know, I got the last one wrong. You divided when you should have multiplied. I know. She was already erasing. Dad, Isabella texted. She said to tell you that the option 2 decision went well, and whatever that means, she wanted you to know. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his daughter, erasing her fraction mistake with the focused intensity of someone correcting a wrong. She was mildly annoyed at herself for, and he thought about a woman across town who had, apparently, texted his 8-year-old to pass a message to him, because that was somehow the line of communication they'd arrived at, which was absurd and also not at all surprising. Tell her thank you, he said. Sophie typed something into the phone. Then, without looking up, she says you're welcome, and also she says Sophie should get the fraction right because the denominator tells you the size of the pieces. Ethan stared at the ceiling. She's right, he said. I know, Sophie said, already rewriting the answer. I like her. It landed simply and completely, the way Sophie's pronouncements always did, without layering or implication, just the clean fact of it. Ethan stood in the doorway for another moment. Me too, Bug, he said quietly. Me too. He went to make dinner, and he didn't examine that further, and the evening went on, and the Hartford winter continued to be committed and gray outside the window, and the file, the careful accumulated file of observations and moments and things he hadn't said yet, was full. It had been full for a while, honestly. He'd just been deciding what to do about it. The file sat full for 6 weeks before anything happened with it, which was not because either of them was unaware of what it contained, but because awareness and readiness are 2 different countries with a significant stretch of difficult terrain between them. February arrived the way February in Hartford always did, without apology, Gray going on gray, the kind of cold that had stopped being dramatic about itself and had simply become the condition of existence. Ethan's shoulder was at 80%, which Dr. Chen called excellent progress, and which Ethan called frustrating because the remaining 20% was exactly where the work happened. The leg had healed cleaner than expected. He walked without a limp now unless he was tired, and even then it was slight enough that most people didn't catch it. He had been at Sterling Group for 5 weeks. The residential development outside the city was back on schedule. The drainage fix had come in under the high estimate. Derek had, somewhere in the process of working together on the third site's material logistics, stopped being a problem and started being genuinely useful in the way that capable people become useful when they stop protecting their territory and start doing their actual job. Ethan had said none of this to Isabella directly, but she had the kind of situational awareness that meant she didn't need to be told. The Voss case moved forward in February. Detective Reyes called Ethan on a Tuesday morning. He was in his car outside the third site, eating a sandwich he'd forgotten to eat at noon, and it was now 2:30, to tell him that the second man from the shooting had been apprehended in Philadelphia 3 weeks prior, and that both he and the man taken at the scene had entered plea agreements that named Conrad Voss as the individual who had contracted the attack. "He was arrested yesterday," Reyes said, "at his office. I thought you'd want to know." Ethan sat with that for a moment. He hadn't thought much about Voss as a person. He'd thought about the SUV, about the moment of it, about the cold pavement and the shots, but the man behind all of it had remained abstract. Now there was an arrest, a person in a room somewhere being processed through a system. "Is it solid?" he asked. "The case?" "The DA thinks so. 2 cooperating witnesses, financial records linking payments to both men, communications that are—" Reyes paused in a way that suggested he was choosing words. "Not subtle. Voss apparently believed the asset transfer he was counting on would happen quickly enough that the evidence wouldn't matter. He was wrong. Substantially." Ethan thanked him and hung up and sat in the car finishing his sandwich, thinking about the specific texture of that morning on 9th Street, the way the engine sounded when the SUV accelerated, the particular quality of the light. He thought about the fact that someone had planned it, had arranged it, had moved people around like pieces on a board, and that the whole elaborate machinery of that plan had been derailed by a man standing at a bus stop, eating a thermos of coffee and thinking about a drainage problem. There was something almost funny about that. Not quite funny enough to laugh at, but in that neighborhood. He called Isabella. She picked up on the second ring, which was unusual. She was typically in something during the day, and he had learned to text first and wait. "I heard," she said, before he could say anything. "Reyes called you too?" "My lawyer called me. About 40 minutes ago." A pause. "Are you okay?" The question landed with a particular weight because it was specific. Not a social inquiry, but an actual question, meaning, the arrest makes it real in a different way. How is that sitting with you? He understood this because it was the kind of question he'd learned to ask about things. "Yeah," he said. "I think so. Are you?" A longer pause this time. I've had a complicated morning." She said it in the way that meant more was underneath it, more she was deciding whether to offer. "I'll tell you about it later." He found out later, which was Thursday, which was still Thursday, would apparently always be Thursday. She arrived later than usual, almost 4, which meant Sophie was already home and was at the kitchen table constructing something out of materials Ethan couldn't immediately identify, some combination of cardboard and tape, and what appeared to be a significant portion of a toilet paper roll. "What is that?" Isabella asked, setting down her bag. "A dolphin habitat," Sophie said without looking up. "For my science project." Isabella looked at Ethan. He shrugged, meaning, "I've asked, it's better not to question the process." She sat across from Sophie and watched the construction for a moment with the slightly focused expression she got around Sophie's projects. Genuine curiosity, no performance. "What kind of habitat?" "Ocean. But I'm making it a tank because an ocean is too big." "That's a practical compromise." "I know. Dad said I could use the tape, but only a little, and I've used a lot, so I'm going to need you to not mention it." Isabella looked at Ethan. "I see nothing," he said, from the stove where he was making something that had started as a plan for chicken and had evolved into a negotiation. Sophie finished a section of the cardboard structure and held it up to inspect it with one eye closed. Isabella, do dolphins ever get lonely? Isabella seemed to consider the question with real attention. I think they're highly social animals, so probably yes, if they're isolated. That's sad. It is. But in this habitat, there are 6. Sophie set it down and started on another section. So they're fine. Good planning, Isabella said. I know. Ethan put dinner on the table at 5:30. The chicken had resolved itself into something with vegetables, edible enough, not the disaster it had threatened to become at one point. Sophie ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had things to get back to, finished her milk, excused herself in the particular formal way she'd picked up from somewhere, and disappeared back to the dolphin habitat. Ethan and Isabella stayed at the table with their coffee, and the apartment settled into the quiet of a winter evening, and eventually she said, I went to the building this morning. He didn't have to ask which building. 9th Street, the Sterling Group headquarters with the name across the facade. I haven't been back since, she said. Since that morning. I've been working remotely or from the satellite office on the north side. I told myself it was practical. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, looking at the table. This morning, I made myself go. How was it? Strange. I expected it to feel dangerous. It didn't. It felt like a building. She paused. What I didn't expect was standing on the sidewalk outside and thinking about you. Her voice was level, but had something in it, something she was choosing to let through. Specifically about the fact that you ran across that street without knowing anything about what you were running into, without knowing me, without knowing what the threat was, without just moved. He was quiet. I've been thinking about it since the arrest this morning, she said, about how close it was, not just that morning, how close it was to you not making it, and if you hadn't, she stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. I don't like thinking about it. Then don't, he said. I can't turn it off like that. I know, I meant, he paused, choosing carefully, you don't have to solve it. It happened and it ended a particular way, and you can be affected by the alternate version without living in it. She looked at him. Is that what you do? With Claire? The question was direct enough that it would have stung from someone else. From her, it didn't sting. It was just honest. Took me a while to learn, he said. The what-ifs are a rabbit hole. You go down far enough and you lose the thread of the actual thing that actually happened, which is, he looked at his coffee, that I'm sitting here, that Sophie is in there building a dolphin situation, that the actual version of events, whatever it cost, is the one we're living in. Isabella was quiet for a long moment. You're better at this than I am, she said. You've had less practice. That's generous. It's accurate. He looked at her. You're better at other things. She raised an eyebrow slightly. Such as? Making decisions, reading a room, not second-guessing yourself after. I second-guess myself constantly. I just do it privately and quickly. That's still better than doing it publicly and slowly. She almost smiled. The almost smile had been becoming more frequent, converting to the actual article more often than it used to. He'd been watching that shift over the months, the gradual recalibration of her face toward expressions that weren't managed, that just happened. Ethan, the weight in her voice again. Yeah. She looked at him with a directness that she'd been building up to. He could see it, the way you can see a wave forming offshore if you're watching for it. I want to say something, and I want you to let me say it before you respond. He set down his cup. Okay. She held his gaze. I have been alone for 3 years. Not lonely, most of the time, because I'm very good at not being lonely. I've built systems for it, full calendars, structured days, work that takes up every available space, and it's worked. A pause. It has worked. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't hoping for this to happen. I had decided, not consciously, but very thoroughly, that the version of myself that existed before Marcus died, the version that could want something like this, was gone, filed away, done. He was very still. And then a man I'd never met ran across the street, she said. And I sat in a chair next to a hospital bed for 11 hours for reasons I couldn't have explained if you'd asked me at the time. She took a breath. And now it's February, and I know that you eat a granola bar for lunch when you're too busy to stop, and that you read to Sophie every night even though she falls asleep before the chapter ends, and that you carry the weight of everything very quietly and won't let people help you with the soup cans. Her jaw was steady. Her eyes were not quite. And I don't know what to do with it, with any of it. But I needed you to know that it's there. The kitchen was very quiet. Down the hall, Sophie was doing something that involved tape, probably too much of it. Ethan looked at the woman across the table. He thought about the morning on 9th Street, and the hospital room, and the narrow kitchen with the soup can, and the Thursdays, and the dolphin facts, and the fraction messages, and sitting in his car on Caldwell Street thinking that something was changing. He thought about the file, which had been full for 6 weeks. "I know it's there," he said. She let out a breath, small, controlled, but real. "I've known for a while," he said. "I've been," he searched for the honest word, "careful about it. I know you have. Because of Sophie, because of the job, because—" He stopped, started again, differently. "After Claire, I put the part of me that opened toward people, that let things in, I put it somewhere safe, so it couldn't take damage, because I couldn't afford to not be functional. Sophie needed me functional." Isabella nodded once, saying nothing, and then you came along, and you didn't ask it to come out. You just sat in the room and it came out anyway, and I didn't know what to do with that either. He looked at the table briefly, back up. "I'm not saying I'm ready for everything. I don't know exactly what ready looks like. But I'm not—" He held her gaze. "I'm not ready, if that makes sense." "It makes sense," she said. "Okay." A pause. "Okay," she said back. They stayed at the table for another hour, talking about nothing in particular and everything in general, and at some point Sophie reappeared to show them a completed section of the dolphin habitat that was genuinely more structurally sophisticated than either of them expected, and Ethan told her so, and she said, "I know," with the simplicity of a person who had assessed her own work accurately, and Isabella said she thought the roof section needed reinforcement on the left side, and Sophie looked at it and agreed and went back to fix it, and they watched her go and then looked at each other and did not look away. It was not a perfect moment. The chicken had been average, the coffee had gone cold, the heating system was doing its thing in the walls. But it was entirely, completely real, and that was worth more than perfect had ever been worth to either of them. Nothing moved fast after that, which was right. Things that have been stopped for a long time don't sprint when they start again. They find their footing first, careful and tentative, making sure the ground holds before putting weight on it. What existed between Ethan and Isabella after that Thursday was not a declaration or a transformation. It was more like a door that had been agreed to be open. The room it led to still needed to be entered, slowly, with the lights on. He took her to dinner in March. Not a grand gesture. A restaurant he knew in the Asylum Hill neighborhood, small and not expensive and consistently excellent. A place he'd been going since before Sophie was born, back when he and Claire would find a sitter and make an event of a Tuesday night. He hadn't been back since. He chose it deliberately, not as a tribute or a ritual, just because it was the best food he knew within 15 miles, and he wanted the night to be good. She arrived in a coat he hadn't seen before, dark green, and she looked slightly different out of the context of the kitchen table or the office. The same, but more intentional, the way people look when they've made a choice about how they appear rather than just appearing. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, but she was almost smiling. "I was going to say nice." "You were going to say something better than nice and then decide it was too much." He held the door. "Maybe." They sat at a corner table and ordered without drama and talked the way they talked, easily, with the specific ease of people who have passed the stage where conversation requires maintenance, where you're filling space, and arrived at the stage where you talk because you actually want to know what the other person thinks. He told her about Ray, properly this time. Ray's history, the 22 years, the way he'd come up in the trade in an era when construction culture was different and rougher, and had some residue of that on him that occasionally surfaced and that he was, in his late 40s, genuinely working on. He told her about the crew on the Meridian site, the guys he'd worked alongside for 2 years, the particular vocabulary of a team that had been together long enough to communicate in shorthand. She told him about the board, not the broad corporate abstraction, but the specific people, the CFO, whose alarm in meetings was his baseline mode and didn't necessarily indicate actual alarm, the board member in Boston who had opposed every acquisition she'd made in 5 years and had been wrong about 4 of them and right about 1, and had never, not once, adjusted his confidence level accordingly. She told it the way you tell things when you've been holding them at arm's length and decided to set them down, with the slight relief of something released. "Do you trust them?" he asked. "The board. I trust some of them. I trust their competence more than their judgment, with a few exceptions." She sipped her wine. "Running a company is... People talk about leadership like it's about vision. And vision matters, but mostly it's about knowing which people to trust with which things and never confusing the categories. The worst decisions I've ever made were made because I trusted the wrong person with the wrong category." "What does that look like when it goes wrong?" She turned her glass slightly on the table. "There was a CFO before the current one, 4 years ago. He was brilliant at numbers. Genuinely, the best financial mind I've worked with. I trusted him on a strategic acquisition that was outside his actual lane. He ran the numbers perfectly and completely missed the human element, the company culture, the integration risks, the people who would leave." She paused. "The acquisition cost us 18 months to recover from. He wasn't wrong about anything in his lane. I put him in the wrong lane." "What did you do?" "Restructured his role, kept him where he was genuinely excellent, and put someone else in the strategic layer." She looked at Ethan directly. "He was upset, initially, but he's still there, and he's doing what he does better than almost anyone I know. That's sometimes the right call looks like a demotion, and it isn't." He thought about Derek. He thought about the way good management actually worked, which was less about authority and more about matching the person to the actual problem. "You're good at it," he said. "Sometimes?" "More than sometimes." She looked at him with the slightly caught expression she got when he said something that reached her directly. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Saying something that's very specific and very accurate and that most people wouldn't think to say." She shook her head slightly. "It's a particular quality of yours. It's..." She stopped. "It's what?" She met his eyes. "It's one of the things," she said simply. He understood what she meant. He felt it settle in him the way the important things did, not with drama, just with weight and permanence. The conversation at dinner moved forward and backward and sideways through the evening, and when the plates were cleared and the check came, which he handled, which she allowed without making it a thing, which he appreciated, they sat for a while longer just talking, because neither of them was in a hurry to end something that was going well, and that itself was new. Both of them had spent years not having things that were going well enough to want to extend. Outside afterward, the March air was cold but less committed than February. There was a suggestion in it, faint, of eventual relent. They walked half a block to where her car was parked and stopped at the curb, and she turned toward him, and they stood there in the particular geography of a night that has arrived at its threshold. "This was good," she said. "Yeah. I'd like to do it again. I was going to suggest next week." Her mouth curved fully this time. Not the almost smile, the actual one, the one that changed her whole face in the specific way he'd been watching develop for 4 months. "Next week," she said. "Okay." He leaned forward and kissed her once, briefly, with the care of someone who understands that some things need to begin gently to last. She didn't move back. Her hand came up to his arm, not gripping, just present, just there. When they separated, she looked at him with an expression that was more open than anything he'd seen on her face, stripped of the control and the management, just her, underneath all of it. "Drive safe," he said. "I always drive safe," she said. "I'm a very responsible driver." "I'm sure you are." "I am. I have data." He laughed. And she got in the car and he stood on the curb and watched the taillights turn the corner, and he stood there for a moment in the Hartford night and breathed the cold air and felt something in his chest that was not complicated, just clear and clean and present. He drove home. Sophie was at a neighbor's for the evening and the apartment was quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, the table that had become the center of something, that had witnessed so many of these conversations. And he thought about the morning on 9th Street, which he'd been thinking about differently lately. Not the violence of it, not the pain, just the fact of that morning. The $23 in his wallet, the bus he was catching, the woman at the curb who was going to be hit and wasn't. He thought about how a single moment had rewritten the next several months of his life, and how those months had contained Sophie's dolphin habitat, and Ray's blunt advice, and Derek becoming useful, and the drainage on the 3rd floor, and Thursday afternoons, and the narrow kitchen, and the file that had gotten full and stayed full, and now had been opened. He thought, you don't get to choose the moment that changes things. You only get to choose what you do when it arrives. He'd chosen to run across the street. Everything after that had been something he hadn't chosen, but had met. Badly, sometimes. Better, other times. Always forward. It was mid-March when the investigation concluded formally. Conrad Voss was indicted on charges that his legal team was, according to everything Ethan read, going to have a genuinely difficult time defending against, given that both men who had carried out the attack were cooperating witnesses and the financial documentation was extensive. The legal process would take its time. These things always did. But Reyes called Isabella to tell her the case was strong and that she should expect a conviction. She told Ethan in a phone call, not on a Thursday, just a regular Wednesday afternoon. "How do you feel?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Relieved and a little, she paused, flat. "I expected to feel more. I've been living with this as an open thing for 5 months, and now it's closing, and I thought it would feel like more than this." "That's normal," he said. "You know that from experience?" "From watching people. When a long problem resolves, the release is smaller than the anticipation of it because you've been adapting to the pressure the whole time. The adaptation doesn't stop the moment the pressure does." Silence on the line. "That's a very construction-specific way of thinking about grief," she said. "Everything's load-bearing when you look at it right." "You're going to say things like that, and I'm just supposed to—" She made a sound that was almost exasperation, almost affectionate, the specific compound of the two that had become its own thing between them. "Anyway, it's done. Mostly done. I wanted you to know." "Okay. Okay." A beat. "How's the residential project?" "On schedule." "Derek?" "Doing his job." "You did that." "He did that." "Ethan." "He did it. I just arranged the conditions." "That is what leadership is," she said, in the tone of someone who has made this point before and will make it again. That is precisely and specifically what leadership is. He didn't argue because she was right, and arguing would have been stubborn rather than honest. "Fine," he said. "Thank you." "Don't push it." She laughed, the real one, unguarded, and said she'd see him Thursday and hung up. He sat in his car and felt the particular warmth of that laugh in his chest and thought about how strange and specific and unearned this particular version of things was. The life that had assembled itself around a morning on 9th Street. The way an act he hadn't thought about had set off a chain of events that led, improbably and without any logical inevitability, to this moment. Sitting in a second-hand car outside a construction site, he was managing for a company run by a woman he'd just made laugh on the phone. Not everything was resolved. The credit card balance was down but not gone. Sophie's school had flagged a potential need for additional support with reading comprehension, which was a new concern that required navigation. His shoulder still gave him specific feedback on cold mornings that Dr. Chen called expected, and he called annoying. There were days at the office that went badly, mismanaged expectations, a materials delay that cascaded into 3 other problems, a communication breakdown with the architect on the second site that cost everyone a week of frustration. There were nights when the grief was still there, not sharp anymore, not reaching the way it used to, but present, the way a permanent thing is present. He didn't fight it on those nights. He let it sit, and in the morning it sat somewhat quieter. He was not fixed. Neither was she. They were both, in the precise clinical sense, still carrying the weight of what they'd lost, would probably always carry some version of it, because that was how loss worked when it was real loss. When it had been someone real, who you would not stop missing just because time had passed and your life had restructured around the space they'd left. But they were carrying it differently now, with company, without the performance of doing fine that had preceded the company. Sophie noticed, with the perception that 8-year-olds have that adults consistently underestimate. She didn't say anything directly. She was 8, not 30, but she began, in March, treating Isabella with a slightly different familiarity, a fraction less formal, a fraction more assuming. She started leaving the apartment at full blast when Isabella was there, instead of turning the volume down slightly in the way she had before, as though she was in the presence of company. She stopped saying Miss Isabella and started saying just Isabella, and when Ethan corrected her the first time she looked at him, with the expression that was both 8 and 40, and said, "She said it was okay." He looked at Isabella. "I told her it was okay," Isabella confirmed with complete composure. He gave up. There were mornings when Isabella's car was in front of the building on Caldwell Street. Not frequently, not routinely, not in any way they'd formalized, just occasionally, when the evening had gone late and the conversation had been the kind that makes distance feel wrong. On those mornings, Sophie would come out of her room and find Isabella at the kitchen table with coffee, already having been awake for an hour because Isabella woke early and couldn't sleep past 6. And Sophie would sit down across from her with the complete unsurprise of a child who has decided something is normal and would like it to remain so. They would talk. About dolphins, mostly. About fractions occasionally. About Marcus, the boy from school, who had, per Sophie's most recent update, apologized about the unicorn comment and was now considered provisionally acceptable again. About the dolphin habitat, which had received an A- from the teacher, which Sophie thought should have been an A because the structural integrity was excellent, and Isabella had agreed completely and said she should appeal it, which Ethan had vetoed. "You can't appeal a third-grade science project grade," he'd said. "Why not?" said Sophie. "Because—" He looked at Isabella, who was watching this with transparent entertainment. "Don't encourage her." "I'm not encouraging her. I'm validating her instinct that good work should be recognized. The dolphin habitat got an A-. It deserved a full A." "Isabella, I'm just saying." Sophie looked between them with the focused attention of someone taking notes. Then she said, "I'm appealing it." She did not get the grade changed. She also did not seem particularly damaged by this outcome, having made her case clearly and been told no, which was, Ethan thought, probably a more useful lesson than the A would have been. He didn't share this analysis with Sophie because she was 8 and didn't need his analysis. He shared it with Isabella that evening, and she said, "You're raising an extremely functional human being with a sincerity that was unqualified." "We'll see," he said. "No," she said. "We can already see." He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, with that openness she was letting through more often now. The thing underneath the management and the control. The thing that was just her, just Isabella, who had wanted to study architecture and had lost a husband at 41 and had sat on a blood-stained sidewalk holding a stranger's hand because she couldn't let go. "She likes you," he said. "I know. That's not easy to get with her. She decides fast, but she decides for real." "I know that too." A pause. "I like her back. That also happened without my permission." She said it with the dry precision she used when something had surprised her and she was being honest about it. "She's the best argument for you that exists, you know that." "For me?" "That you're good," she said simply. "That you're actually good. Anyone can perform well in a crisis. Fewer people raise a child the way you've raised her." She held his gaze. "I pay attention to evidence." He didn't say anything. He let it land and stay landed, which was something he was getting better at, receiving things without deflecting them, without the reflex to minimize or redirect. It was work. It didn't come naturally, but it was the right kind of work. April came, and with April, some warmth. Tentative, provisional, the kind that Hartford offered in small installments before committing. The trees on Caldwell Street started their slow, determined return. Sophie asked if she could plant something in the window box, and Ethan said yes, which he realized too late was open-ended permission, and by the second week of April, the window box contained what Sophie described as a herb garden, but what appeared to be primarily soil and ambition, with a small green emergence that might have been basil. Isabella came on a Saturday in April, which was new, not Thursday, Saturday, with no work bag and a slightly different version of herself, so more at ease in her body, more willing to just be in the room without an agenda. She brought pastries from a bakery Ethan didn't know, and Sophie claimed one immediately and went to the window to inspect the herb garden and report on its progress. And Isabella stood beside Ethan in the narrow kitchen with the spring light coming through the window and the heating system finally, for the first time in months, at rest. "I like it here," she said. He looked at her. "You've been here 40 times." "I know." She looked at the window, at Sophie crouching by the box, at the small green things that might become basil. "I still like it." He stood beside her and felt the truth of it. That this apartment, this narrow, impractical apartment with the aspirational heating and the water stain on the ceiling and the kitchen where you could touch both walls, had become, without any formal announcement, a home to more than two people. "The water stain," he said. She looked at the ceiling. "What about it?" "I've been meaning to report it for 7 months." She looked at it for a moment. "Don't," she said. "Why?" She glanced at him. "Because the first time I really looked at this apartment, I looked at that stain, and I thought, this is where he lives. This is the actual shape of his life." A pause. "I'd like it to stay." He looked at the stain on the ceiling, then at her. "Okay," he said. Outside, Sophie said something to the basil, actual words, encouragingly delivered, and stood up and reported to no one in particular that she thought it was growing. The April morning continued to be April. The city outside the window went about its ordinary life. And in the narrow kitchen on Caldwell Street, two people who had learned the hard way that nothing lasts forever stood next to each other in the morning light and understood, without saying it, that some things, the right things, the real things, were worth building anyway. The basil grew, not dramatically, not in the way of things in movies where the garden blooms overnight as a visual metaphor for everything going right. It grew the way real things grow, slowly, unevenly, with two stalks that did well and one that just didn't take despite identical conditions and identical attention, because that is what growing things do. They make their own decisions about what they're willing to become. Sophie monitored it with the systematic dedication of a scientist and reported its progress at dinner every few nights. And by May, there was enough that she clipped a small amount and insisted it go into the pasta, and Ethan complied. And it was genuinely good, and he told her so, and she received this information with the equanimity of someone who had expected no other outcome. The spring moved the way springs do after hard winters, with a quality of relief underneath it, something released. Ethan noticed it in the city, in the way people walked differently when the cold finally stopped being the dominant fact of every outdoor moment. He noticed it in Sophie, who had begun spending Saturday mornings at the small park 2 blocks from Caldwell Street with a group of kids from school, a social development that he tracked with the careful attention of a man who understood that his daughter's independence was the whole point, and was still figuring out how to feel about it. He noticed it in Isabella, whose Saturdays had become a regular feature of the week, not formalized, not announced as such, just present, in the way that things become true through repetition rather than declaration. He noticed it in himself, which was the part that still surprised him most. He was not a man who had been given to noticing his own internal states. He had spent 4 years being functional rather than reflective, keeping the machinery of the life running because the machinery needed to run and there wasn't another engineer available. The noticing felt new. Or not new exactly, recovered. Like a capacity that had gone dormant and was finding its way back. Conrad Voss went to trial in June. Ethan didn't attend the proceedings, though Reyes kept him informed. Isabella attended 2 days of testimony, accompanied by her legal team, and came to the apartment on Caldwell Street both evenings afterward. Not in her professional mode, not with the coat and the control fully assembled, but quieter, more interior, sitting at the kitchen table with the particular stillness of someone processing something that required time to settle. The first evening, she didn't talk about the trial at all. She ate dinner with Ethan and Sophie, listened to Sophie's extended theory about why summer reading programs were structurally unfair while still being good in principle. And when Sophie went to bed, she sat at the table and they talked about something else entirely. The sixth project site that was coming online for Sterling Group's division. A community center renovation that Ethan had argued for taking on because the scope was exactly right for what the team had developed into. She had approved it 3 weeks prior. He wanted her view on the timeline. They talked about the timeline. It was grounding, the specific and practical nature of it, and he understood that this was what she needed. Not to process the trial out loud, not yet, but to be in a room with someone who was going to talk to her about concrete things while she sorted through the harder ones internally, and to not be alone while she did it. He understood this because it was what he had needed in the first months after Claire. The presence without the pressure to perform the grief in a legible way. Just company. The second evening she talked about it. The man they put on the stand, she said. The one who drove the vehicle. He was 26. She looked at her hands. He talked about Voss like someone who had been completely convinced that the action was justified, like he'd been told a story, and he believed the story. What was the story? That I'd stolen something from Voss, that I'd used connections to sabotage his career, cost him a deal that would have saved his company. She shook her head slightly. None of it was true. The deal fell apart on its own metrics. I didn't do anything except exist in the same market and be more competitive. She paused. But he believed it. He was 26 and he believed it. And now he's going to spend a significant portion of his life incarcerated because a 53-year-old man told him a convincing story. Ethan was quiet for a moment. And Voss? Voss sat at that table and looked like a man who is still not entirely convinced he's the problem. Her jaw worked slightly. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the anger, which is, I've processed the anger mostly. It's the certainty. That someone can be that certain they're entitled to. She stopped. To remove you, he said. To remove me. The words landed flat and hard. Because I was an inconvenience, because I was in the way of something he wanted. She looked at him. You ran across the street for me. He put machinery in motion to end me. And both of you were responding to the same moment, the same woman standing on the same sidewalk. And I can't... She pressed her lips together briefly. I can't make those two things fit in the same world sometimes. They fit, he said. That's actually the thing. The same world contains both of them. That's not a contradiction. That's just the range. She looked at him. The range of what people are capable of. He held her gaze steadily. Voss was capable of that. I was capable of the other thing. Neither of us chose to be those people in that moment. We just were. He paused. That's why the choice before the moment matters. The person you've built yourself into before the crisis is the one who shows up during it. She was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was still. Outside, the June evening was doing what June evenings do in Hartford when they're good, warm and long and unwilling to go dark at a reasonable hour. Who built you into that person? She asked finally. It was not a rhetorical question. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way she ever asked him anything. Claire, he said. Partly. She had a way of responding to things that I absorbed over 8 years. She would move toward the problem, not the way I did on 9th Street, not physically, but her instinct was always toward, not away. He paused. And my father. And the work. The work teaches you things about what holds and what doesn't. And yourself, she said. Maybe. Some. More than some. She said it simply. You made choices before I ever met you that made you the person who crossed that street. I'm aware of that. He nodded. He looked at the table, then at her. Are you okay? With the trial? She considered it genuinely rather than giving him the automatic fine. I will be, she said. I'm not all the way there, but I can see it from here. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not a grand gesture, just contact. Just, I'm here and you don't have to be all the way there tonight. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while. Conrad Voss was convicted on all counts in the third week of June. Reyes called Ethan in the morning before he'd left for the office. The call was brief and informational, and at the end, Reyes said in the slightly awkward tone of a detective stepping outside his professional register for a moment, "For what it's worth, what you did on that sidewalk, that mattered." Ethan thanked him and hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he called Isabella. "I know," she said, picking up immediately. "My lawyer just called." A pause. "It's done." "Yeah." A breath on the line. "I'm standing outside on the terrace," she said. "It's a good morning, clear. I keep looking at the city and thinking, it's just a city. It's just Hartford doing what Hartford does, and the fact that it's beautiful this morning isn't because of the verdict. It would have been beautiful anyway, but I keep seeing it like it's specifically good this morning." "That's allowed," he said. "Is it? I feel like I should be more—" "Isabella?" "Yeah." "Let it be a good morning." A pause, then quietly, "Okay." He could hear her breathing, and the ambient sound of Hartford from wherever her terrace was, the city she had built her life in, that she had almost lost her life in, that was doing what cities do on clear June mornings, without any awareness of the weight of the year that had just concluded. "Come over for dinner tonight," he said. "Sophie wants to use the basil in something else, and I've been overruled on the menu." She laughed. The real one, the unguarded version that still surprised him sometimes with its entirety. "What are we having?" She said pasta again, but with more basil. I said that's not a different meal. She said it's completely different if you add more basil. I don't have a strong counter-argument. "She's right," Isabella said. "More basil makes it different." "You're not helping." "I know." He could hear her smiling. "I'll be there at 6. She was there at 5:47, which was Isabella being Isabella. If she was going to be somewhere, she was going to be slightly early, because late implied lack of preparation, and lack of preparation was not in her vocabulary. She brought wine for herself and Ethan, and a specific sparkling water that Sophie had decided was the only acceptable non-milk beverage, which Isabella had begun keeping track of without being asked, the way she kept track of things she considered worth tracking. Sophie made the pasta. Not alone. Ethan was beside her the whole time, managing the stove because 8-year-olds and open flames required adult supervision regardless of confidence level. But she made the decisions. The amount of basil, which was aggressive. The salt, which she added with the gravity of someone who understood seasoning, mattered. The timing, which she got right on the first attempt. They ate at the small table by the window with the parking lot view, the 3 of them, and Sophie talked about summer, which was starting in 2 weeks, and about the reading program that she had revised her position on. It was now acceptable on condition that the book list be expanded to include more dolphin content, a request she was preparing to formally submit to the school librarian. "You should write a letter," Isabella said. "I am writing a letter," Sophie said. "I've been working on it." Ethan looked at Isabella. She looked back at him with an expression that was composed, but had the quality of someone who was finding this very amusing and choosing not to show it fully out of respect for the seriousness with which Sophie was treating the matter. "Can I read it before you send it?" he asked Sophie. "You can read it, but you can't change the main argument." "What's the main argument?" "That dolphins are underrepresented in children's literature relative to their cognitive complexity." A silence. "That's a strong argument," Isabella said. "I know," said Sophie, and went back to her pasta. After dinner, after Sophie had been convinced to leave the dishes and go to bed, a negotiation that went 2 rounds before Ethan's parental authority asserted itself on the basis that it was a school night and summer hadn't started yet. Ethan and Isabella were alone at the kitchen table with the remains of the wine and the particular quiet of a house where a child has gone to sleep and taken all the ambient noise with her. "She's something," Isabella said. Not for the first time, with the same quality each time, like she was still mildly astonished by the fact. "She is," he agreed. Isabella turned her glass slowly on the table. She had something on her face, a particular arrangement he had learned to read over the months, which was the look she got when she had decided to say something and was finding the exact position of it. He waited. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that there is no correct answer, that I'm not, This isn't a test and it isn't a setup, and you can say whatever the actual answer is without worrying about what the answer should be. He set down his glass. Okay. She met his eyes. What do you want? For your life. Not for Sophie's life, not for the job, just for you. What does it look like? What does the thing you want look like? He felt the question reach him in the specific way her questions did, down past the automatic social response, into the actual. He took it seriously. He thought about it the way she'd asked him to, which was honestly, without editing for what sounded right. Ordinary, he said finally. She waited. I know that sounds, he started. It doesn't sound like anything bad, she said. Keep going. I want mornings that aren't a crisis management exercise. I want Sophie to go to college someday for something she actually wants, not something that was available. I want to build things that are built correctly and last. He paused. I want to be not alone, in the way that matters, not just company, but the actual not alone. He looked at her steadily. I think you know what I mean. I do, she said. What about you? He asked. What do you want? She was quiet for a moment, and he watched her do the thing she rarely did, which was to be uncertain in a visible way, to let the process of arriving at the answer show in her face rather than presenting the answer as already assembled. I want to stop running so fast, she said. I've been running fast for 3 years, not because the destination is clear, but because if I slow down, there's too much space for the things I've been running past. She looked at the table. I want to stop running past them. I want to... She paused. Look at them. Be in the same room with them. She looked up at him. I want to be here. Actually here. Not performing here. He understood every word of that. You've been here for a while, he said. Actually here. You might not have noticed. Something moved across her face that was not quite ready to be a specific expression yet. Yeah? Yeah. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table the way he had during the trial conversation. Just contact, just presence, and put her hand on his. He held it. Ethan, she said. Yeah. I love you. She said it with the same directness she brought to everything. Not performed, not decorated, not building to it. Just the fact of it, placed on the table between them the way she placed facts when she was done deciding and ready to say the thing out loud. I don't say things I don't mean. I'm sure you know that by now, and I mean that. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't uncertainty, just the quality of a moment that deserves to be its size before you speak into it. I love you too, he said. Simple, completely true. I've been sitting with it for a while because you're careful. Because it matters enough to be careful about. She nodded. She didn't look away. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat at the kitchen table in the apartment on Caldwell Street with the parking lot view and the aspirational heating and the water stain on the ceiling that was staying, and they did not make any dramatic declarations or plans or promises beyond the ones already implicit in the year they had just come through together. Some things don't need more ceremony than that. Some things are sealed by the accumulation of Tuesday phone calls and Thursday afternoons and Saturday mornings and pasta with too much basil and hands held in hospital rooms and soup cans and fraction messages and dolphin habitats. The big words, when they finally came, were really just the official language for something that had been true for a long time. It was Sophie who first said the word, though she used it as a question and directed it at the ceiling rather than at either of them specifically. They had been at Isabella's apartment, a penthouse in the Sterling Group's residential tower on the east side of the city, large and well-appointed and, in Sophie's assessment, very clean and kind of echoey, for dinner on a Sunday in August when Sophie looked around at the space and said, to no particular person, "Is this going to be where we live?" Ethan and Isabella looked at each other over Sophie's head. "We haven't talked about that yet," Ethan said. "I know," Sophie said, still looking at the ceiling, apparently conducting some kind of spatial assessment. "I'm just asking." "What would you think?" Isabella asked. Careful, genuinely asking. Sophie brought her gaze down and looked at Isabella with the full, frank assessment she reserved for things that actually mattered. I'd think it needs more stuff in it, she said. It's very empty, and the basil can't live here. There's not enough window. We could fix those things, Isabella said. And Gerald? Sophie added. Gerald has to come. Gerald, Ethan said. The blanket, Isabella said. She named the blanket Gerald. I know she named the blanket Gerald. Sophie was still looking at Isabella with that measuring expression. My mom's picture is in Dad's room, she said. Not as an obstacle or a warning, just a fact she was putting on the table. It would still come. Isabella held her gaze without flinching, without over-reassuring, without performing anything. I'd expect it to, she said. Sophie absorbed this, nodded once. Okay, she said. Then probably yes. She went back to her dinner, the matter resolved to her satisfaction, leaving the adults to look at each other across the table in the aftermath of a 9-year-old's architectural review of their future. They were not ready to move that August. There were things to navigate first, practical things, the apartment lease, the school district question, the conversation about what a combined life actually looked like between two people who had each developed elaborate and functional systems for being alone, and now had to figure out where those systems intersected and where they conflicted. None of it was simple. Some of it was frustrating in the specific way that combining two adult lives is always somewhat frustrating. Not dramatic frustration, not the kind that means anything is wrong, just the friction of two different operating systems learning to run on the same hardware. There was a conversation in September about money that was uncomfortable in the way those conversations always are when the financial situation of the two people involved is as different as theirs. Ethan initiated it because he was someone who believed in naming the uncomfortable thing rather than walking around it until someone tripped over it. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, because it was always this table, this kitchen, and said, "We need to talk about the financial thing." She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. Okay. The disparity. He said it plainly. You have $4 billion. I have a good salary and a credit card that's almost paid off and a secondhand car. We need to have an actual conversation about what that means if we're building something together. Because I've thought about it and I know what I'm not okay with, and I need to know what you expect, and those things need to match. She looked at him steadily. What are you not okay with? Being kept. Being situated in a way where my financial security depends on your continued presence in my life. I've worked for everything I have, and I need it to stay something I've worked for. He met her eyes. Not because of pride, because of how I need to see myself. I understand that, she said, without argument, without the slight edge she got when she thought someone was being impractical. Just, I understand that. And Sophie's future, he said. I want to provide for her. I'm not in a position to match what you could give her, but she needs to know that her father is the one who... Ethan, Isabella leaned forward slightly. I would never structure anything in a way that made Sophie feel her father wasn't her provider, or that made you feel it. The money is mine. It was before this, and it will be whatever we are. It doesn't come with conditions, and it doesn't come between things. She paused. What I have is for the life we build, not to define it. He looked at her for a long time. You mean that? I always mean what I say. You know that. He did know that. He had learned it over 12 months of knowing her, that she was the most literal person he'd ever been close to, in the best possible sense. She said what she meant, and she meant what she said, and she did not use language decoratively or strategically in her personal life, even when her professional life required its share of careful word management. Okay, he said. Okay. We're going to have this conversation again at some point, he said. When something specific comes up, we're going to have to work it out in the specific. I know, we'll work it out. It might be uncomfortable. Most things worth anything are uncomfortable some of the time. She tilted her head slightly. Are you going to keep talking yourself out of this? I'm not talking myself out of it. I'm talking myself into it properly. She looked at him for a moment. There's a difference? Big one. She picked up her coffee. Okay then, talk yourself in. He did. Slowly, imperfectly, with the occasional backward step that is the actual texture of moving forward when you're someone who has learned to be careful. By October, they had begun, in the practical sense, to combine things. Not the apartments, not yet, but the daily architecture of the life. He had a drawer at the penthouse. She had things at Caldwell Street. Sophie had an ongoing aesthetic consultation project at the penthouse, which mostly involved telling Isabella which surfaces needed more objects on them. The anniversary of the shooting was on a Thursday. Neither of them had made a plan for it. It arrived the way anniversaries do, flagged by the calendar, weighted differently than the surrounding days, asking something of you before you've decided what you want to give. Ethan was at the office in the morning. He got through the first 2 hours on the basis of routine: the emails, the site call with the community center project foreman, the materials review for the 6th site that was now 2 months into its timeline and performing well. He did the work, and the work was real, and it helped, the way real work always helped him, by giving his hands and his mind a place to be. Isabella called at 10. "I keep thinking about that morning," she said without preamble. She knew he would know which morning. "Me too," he said. "I'm at the office. I keep looking out the window at 9th Street and thinking—" She paused. "It's strange, not bad strange, just a year is a specific amount of time, and it's very clear looking at it from here how much has changed." "Yeah. Are you okay?" "I think so." He meant it. "You?" "I think so," she said. A pause. "I want to go there. Tonight. Back to where it happened." She said it in the way she said things when she'd decided and was telling him rather than asking, but with a slight question in it, which was as close as she got to checking whether something was okay. "I think I need to close the loop on it somehow. Stand there and look at the building and look at the street and—" "Yeah," he said. "Let's do that." Sophie came with them. This had been Ethan's suggestion, and Isabella had looked at him for a moment when he made it, and then said yes, because she understood what he meant. That Sophie was part of what the year had been, that leaving her out of the marking of it would be its own kind of inaccuracy. They went at 6 in the evening, the 3 of them, when the light was still good but had taken on the quality of early autumn evenings, gold and long-shadowed. Ethan parked on the side street, and they walked to 9th and Sterling Avenue on foot. The city was doing its early evening thing. People heading home, a few heading out, the specific energy of a Thursday at 6, neither rushed nor entirely relaxed. The building was there with its name across the facade, unchanging. The sidewalk was the sidewalk, repaired, ordinary, no indication of anything that had happened on it except in the memories of the people present. They stood on the far side of the street, roughly where Ethan had been standing that morning. Sophie looked at the crosswalk, looked at the building, looked at her father. "Is that where you ran?" she asked. "Yeah." She looked at the distance, maybe 40 feet of crosswalk and sidewalk. "That's not very far," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. But you got there in time." "Barely." He looked at the pavement across the street. "Yeah." Sophie took his hand. Not dramatically, just took it, the way she'd taken it when he came home from the hospital, with a completeness that didn't require elaboration. He held it. Isabella was standing slightly to his left, looking at the entrance of the building. He watched her face do the work of being in the place. Not shutting it down, not performing the emotion, just letting herself stand in the geography of it and feel what it produced. She turned to look at him. The gold light of the early evening was in her face, and she looked like herself, like the specific and particular person he had come to know through 12 months of kitchens and hospital rooms and job sites and dinners and Thursdays and all of it, the complicated real version of her, not the composed public one and not the perfectly vulnerable private one, but the actual one, the one that existed in the imperfect middle ground between the two. "Thank you," she said. He knew she didn't mean the logistical thank you. She didn't mean for coming tonight or for the dinner reservation she didn't know about yet. She meant the morning. She meant everything from that morning to this evening. "You don't have to keep," he started. "I know I don't have to." She held his gaze. "I want to. Once a year, standing on this street, I want to say it. You can tell me it's not necessary, and I'm going to say it anyway." He didn't tell her it wasn't necessary. "You're welcome," he said. Sophie looked between them. "Can we eat soon? I'm hungry." The moment broke cleanly, the way moments should break when they've been properly honored. Not shattered, just concluded. Ethan looked at his daughter and felt the laugh come up from somewhere genuine. "Yes," he said, "we can eat soon." "Where are we going?" He looked at Isabella. She was almost smiling, which was moving toward the actual, which arrived in the next moment. The full one, the one that was just her. "I made a reservation," she said. "Somewhere Sophie hasn't been." Sophie's eyes went wide with the specific excitement of a new restaurant. "Is it fancy?" "Dad doesn't like fancy." "It's not too fancy," Isabella said, "but it has very good pasta, and they use fresh basil." Sophie looked at her father with an expression that communicated her complete support for this plan. They walked back to the car, Sophie between them, holding Ethan's hand on one side and reaching for Isabella's on the other, with the casual assumption of someone who has decided this is the arrangement and would like it maintained. Isabella took her hand without pause, and they walked, the three of them, through the Hartford evening, through the city that had been the setting for all of it, the tragedy and the recovery and the long, slow business of learning to trust the future again. The restaurant was small and warm, and the pasta was excellent. Sophie ate enthusiastically and told the waiter with complete sincerity that the basil was almost as good as hers, which the waiter received well. Ethan and Isabella drank wine and talked and were in the room the way they'd learned to be in rooms together. Actually there, not performing it. At some point during the meal, Sophie looked up from her plate and said, to neither of them in particular, "I want to ask Isabella a question." "Okay," Ethan said. Sophie looked at Isabella directly. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. Not aggressively, not fearfully, just with the straightforward need for information that was her primary mode of engagement with the world. Isabella held Sophie's gaze with the steadiness she brought to things that mattered. "Yes," she said, "like, really stay. Not just a lot, but stay." "Really stay," Isabella said. "That's what I want, if it's okay with you." Sophie considered this the way she considered the dolphin habitat and the fraction problem and the letter to the librarian, with genuine thought, not performance. Then she said, "It's okay with me," and returned to her pasta. It was, Ethan thought, the most straightforward contract negotiation he had ever witnessed. Both parties clear on terms, agreement reached, moving on. He looked at Isabella across the table. She was looking at Sophie with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, not the fond amusement that was her usual mode with his daughter, but something older and more unguarded, something that looked like the answer to a question she'd stopped asking a long time ago. He reached across the table and touched her hand. She looked at him. The restaurant went on around them, warm and ordinary and full of people eating dinner on a Thursday in September, none of them aware that the three people at the corner table were in the middle of the most important ordinary moment of their respective lives. "I love you," he said. He'd been saying it since June and it hadn't gotten smaller. It had gotten more specific. That was the thing about the real version of it. It didn't stay abstract. It became particular. It became about the exact person in front of you, the complicated, real specific person, not the idea of them. "I love you," she said back. No decorating, no building, just the fact. Sophie said, "Are you two doing the love thing again?" "Yes," they both said simultaneously. Sophie shook her head with the weary tolerance of a child who has accepted that the adults in her life have certain recurring behaviors that she cannot control. "Okay," she said. "But can we get dessert after?" They got dessert after. And the year closed on itself the way years do when they've contained everything they were supposed to contain. Not neatly, not with all the edges matched up, because years that matter don't work like that. They work like the basil on the windowsill, unevenly, according to their own logic, with two stalks that do well and one that just doesn't take. And you tend it anyway because the ones that do take are worth it. Ethan Walker had left his apartment on a Thursday morning 14 months ago with $23 in his wallet and a daughter who believed her daddy could fix anything. He had walked to a bus stop thinking about drainage problems. He had crossed a street without thinking because someone was in danger, and that was the person he was. Not a hero in any formal sense, not trained or designated or prepared. Just someone who had built himself through years of difficult and unremarkable days into the kind of person who moves toward the problem. He hadn't fixed everything. He hadn't fixed grief, his or anyone else's. He hadn't fixed the credit card, though it was gone now. He hadn't fixed the complicated truth that Sophie still talked to her mother sometimes, quietly, in her room, in the way that children maintain their own private relationships with loss that adults don't always know how to witness. He hadn't fixed the part of him that still reached for Claire sometimes in the specific moment before full waking, the habitual reach of 8 years that 4 years of absence hadn't entirely erased. Some things don't get fixed. They get carried differently. They get carried with better company. They get carried in a life that has grown large enough around them that the weight distributes more evenly, that doesn't buckle under it. Isabella Sterling had buried herself in work for 3 years and called it functioning and been, in the narrowest possible sense, correct. She had been functional. She had run a company. She had managed. She had not been alive in the way she'd been alive before. She had known this and had decided, not consciously but thoroughly, that the trade was acceptable, that the version of her that could want the full thing was gone, filed, finished. She had been wrong. It was not gone. It had been waiting in the patient way that real things wait, not urgently, not calling out to be found, just there, surviving the weather, present when the conditions finally shifted. The conditions had shifted on a Thursday morning on 9th Street, because of a drainage problem Ethan had been thinking about, because of a bus that ran 2 minutes late, because of $23 and a granola bar and a man who didn't know her name but ran across the street anyway. The smallest hinges carry the heaviest doors. That's not a poetic observation. It's a structural fact, the kind of thing you understand if you've spent enough time around what holds things together and what doesn't. The catastrophic failures are rarely where you expect them, and the things that hold, the things that actually hold, are rarely the grand architectural gestures. They're the small, repeated, unglamorous choices. Show up, tell the truth, move toward the problem. Hold on. In the spring following that autumn anniversary dinner, Ethan and Isabella got married in a garden outside the city that was in bloom in the inexact way of mid-May. Some things flowering, some things still working toward it. The whole space in the process of becoming what it was going to be. It was small. 50 people, the ones who mattered, none of the performance that Isabella's position could have demanded, and that she had declined, because she had learned or relearned that the most important things in her life had all happened quietly, and that this one deserved to be quiet too. Sophie wore a dress the color of the basil plant that was now thriving on the windowsill of their new apartment. They had found somewhere that was neither Caldwell Street nor the penthouse, but something between them, with a kitchen wide enough that you could not touch both walls simultaneously, and a window box with sufficient light, and an extra bedroom that Sophie had furnished according to a vision that required 2 trips to the thrift store and 1 very long afternoon of questionable but earnest labor. Gerald the blanket occupied a place of honor on her bed. She walked down the aisle ahead of them, scattering flower petals with the focused precision of a scientist conducting an experiment, making sure the distribution was even, pausing once to assess her progress and correct a gap in coverage on the left side. Ray Dominguez was there in the 3rd row and looked precisely as uncomfortable in formal clothing as anyone who knew him would have predicted, and nodded once at Ethan when he passed in the way that communicated everything and required nothing else. Ethan stood at the front of the garden and watched Isabella come through the gate and walk toward him, and she was not the woman in the charcoal coat from the sidewalk on 9th Street, or the woman in the hospital chair, or the woman at the kitchen table on Caldwell Street, or the woman in the restaurant on the anniversary. She was all of those people and none of them fully, and she was herself, walking toward him on a May afternoon with the slightly imperfect gait of someone who had worn heels less than she'd have liked in the last year, and wasn't about to admit the shoes were harder than expected. He watched her walk toward him, and he thought, this is the version of things. Not the version you plan, or the version you imagined, or the version anyone would have scripted from the outside. The actual version, with all the specific weight and specific joy of having come through what they'd come through to stand in this garden on this day. She reached him. She looked at him with the expression that had no management in it, that was just her, entirely present, entirely here. You're here, he said, because it was the first thing he thought, and he'd stopped editing the first thing he thought somewhere in the last year. I'm here, she said. Actually, here. And she was. They both were. Entirely and imperfectly. and without any of the guarantees that people sometimes pretend come with the good moments, because there are no guarantees, only the choice to build anyway, to tend the basil and repair the drainage and hold the hand and cross the street, and to keep choosing every ordinary Thursday, every complicated morning, to be the person who moves toward the thing that matters. Sophie distributed the last of her petals and looked up at her father and at the woman who was going to stay, and she smiled, the uncomplicated smile of a child who has assessed the situation and found it acceptable, who has done her due diligence and arrived at a conclusion she intends to stand behind. Outside the garden, Hartford did what Hartford does. The city moved and breathed and went about its business in the beautiful, indifferent way of cities, not knowing and not needing to know that 3 people inside a garden on its outskirts had built something that would last. The basil was doing fine,